Hey guys, welcome to Fanfic Fanatics. So in today's video we are gonna see, what if neglected Deku and fell in love with Hagakure? Part 2. Before starting, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you are interested in MHA fanfictions. This story is All the Power by Big Teddy 3498. Now without wasting any more time, let's dive in. Izuku and Kaminari return to the student stands with arms full of snacks just in time for the match between Tokiyami and Bakugo to start. As he has expected, Tokiyami didn't last long with Bakugo's explosion lighting up the area. Dark Shadow did take a page from Uraraka playback and tore up the ground to launch debris at Bakugo. It delayed him only slightly enough for the quirk to try again, but Bakugo was faster and landed on Tokiyami. The gang of friends ate their snacks as they watched the last match before the finals. Toru gave Izuku a beaming smile in thanks for the food, and both Kaminari and Mina smirked at the Greenette's small blush while talking to their invisible friend. Meanwhile, Aizawa was cursing in his head because of the upcoming match. Nezu had already called him to warn Midnight and Cementos. He had struggled to press the mic button on the staff's headsets, but he managed finally. Be very vigilante in the next match. Aizawa's voice was muffled by the bandages but went through enough to be understood. What? Expecting an attack, Midnight looked around casually in the stands for any danger. Should we call off the match? Cementos butted in. Not an attack, Midoriya and Bakugo have some bad history. Midnight snorted. Come on, show. It's not like in past years, never had anything similar. They'll just fight it out and then they will be like nothing ever happened. Not the same. Be ready to stop the match. Aizawa let go of the comms button and Midnight thinned her lips in concern. Bakugo was given 15 minutes to rest between the semifinals and the finals. He spent them in the waiting room. Meanwhile, Izuku finished his snacks with his friends. No, I prefer the teriyaki. Izuku decided. I mean, sweet and sour is alright, but I like this one better. Nah, barbecue is where it's at. Mina wiped her face with a napkin. Midoriya, shouldn't you be getting down there? Zero pointed down to the field. I'll be there when they call my name, he said cryptically. Toru narrowed her eyes at him and pinched his arm. What are you planning? Stop that and nothing. I'm not planning anything. He rubbed where she had squeezed his skin together. Just at that time, Midnight called Izuku to the stage. Izuku got up from his seat, kicked off his shoes, and then jumped off the railing from the students' stands. He heard a few shouts of panic from his friends and classmates, but with a small release of kinetic through his feet, he landed near where he should have. The crowd loved that and cheered louder. As for his friends, Kaminari and Mina cheered along, Zero clapped, and Toru glared daggers at him. He gave an apologetic smile towards her and then turned to where Bakugo was walking on stage. Bakugo was glaring across the stage toward Izuku. For his part, he looked calmly back at his tormentor for the past 10 years. His placid face hid the roiling anger and loathing toward the blonde before him. Do you remember the rules? Midnight looked to Bakugo for an answer and he nodded. Then she looked at Izuku. Loss by ring out, tapping out, unconsciousness, or can't continue. No lethal attacks and no unsportsmanlike actions. I remember them perfectly. Midnight gave Izuku another look as if she was trying to read him, but Izuku revealed nothing. Correct. We will stop the match if you break any rules or we decide things have gone too far. Midnight reiterated. Let the final match start. Izuku and Bakugo stared at each other for a full 10 seconds. Izuku showed nothing on his face and Bakugo was giving Izuku a deeper scowl by the second. The first move was by Izuku taking a step forward and then another. He walked forward until he reached the 5 steps and then Bakugo acted by launching forward with a yell and blasted Izuku. He didn't dodge or react in any way as the explosions covered him. Bakugo didn't let up as he twisted around and struck at Izuku's back. Again and again, Bakugo moved around Izuku as he blasted him from any angle he could. After a full minute of this, Bakugo backed off to see the results. In the smoke, Izuku stood with his shirt in ruins. His skin was soot-stained but unharmed by the explosions. The only thing Izuku did other than absorb the heat and kinetic energy was hold his breath so he didn't inhale the smoke. The crowd watched in silence as the smoke cleared enough for Izuku to be visible. With a blast of kinetic energy from all sides, the smoke was cleared. Bakugo glared at Izuku with anger at showing him up, but before he could say anything, Izuku did while emitting thermal energy to make the air distorted around the arena. I'm going to make you yield. With that, Izuku leaned forward and blasted toward Bakugo with kinetic energy. His fist connected with Bakugo's unprotected stomach and the blonde bent over from the impact. Then the secondary blast came and Bakugo was launched back. The kinetic blast from his fist was twofold what Izuku delivered physically, and it showed as Katsuki tried to suck air in and only managed to throw up what food he had in his stomach. Meanwhile, Izuku began to walk around the downed blonde and put himself between the edge of the ring and his target. He waited until the villain got back up on unsteady legs. With a roar, Bakugo launched forward with an explosion. He tried to dodge when Izuku raised his hand and aimed it at Bakugo, but he wasn't faster than lightning. The bolt hit him directly in the shoulder and he cried in pain. Izuku didn't stop after that and met the head-on charge with his own. The only difference was that Izuku released more energy than Bakugo and he was launched back and bounced off the ground multiple times until he stopped with his arm hanging limp at his side. Izuku began to walk forward again as Bakugo tried to get up with his hand on his injured shoulder. With a shaking hand, he relocated his shoulder and turned just in time to get a heel to his chest. Izuku propelled forward until he caught up with Katsuki and grabbed him before throwing him to the center of the ring. The blast Bakugo launched at Izuku was nothing to pay attention to. The bomber stopped his momentum with his explosion but wasn't fast enough for the next lightning bolt that hit his leg. With some panic, Bakugo put his hands together to make a flash bomb to get some space, but the bright light was absorbed into Izuku, who was already above him. He grabbed his head and slammed his knee into his nose, shattering it and making Bakugo see stars. Trying to get space, the blonde made a smokescreen with his quirk, but that didn't slow Izuku down. Switching to thermal vision, Izuku rocketed forward and slammed a palm on Bakugo's ribs. With a crack, Bakugo was sent out of the smoke. Izuku calmly walked out of the smoke into a laying Bakugo trying to get up. "Bakugo, can you continue?" Midnight asked in hopes the blonde would give up. "Yes." Bakugo growled out and stood up to see Izuku between the edge of the ring and him. He sneered again. Time to end this farce. Izuku watched as Bakugo launched himself upwards and began to spin rapidly with his explosions. For his part, Izuku calmly raised his arm and absorbed all the heat Bakugo produced, waste not, and all that. With a loud explosion, Izuku met Bakugo's super mover head-on. In the smoke, Katsuki's hand was on Izuku's face with smoke still rising. With wide eyes, he tried to retreat, but Izuku was faster. Propelled with kinetic energy blasts, Izuku reached Bakugo and grabbed him by the face just like he was just a second before and then slammed him into the ground. Izuku didn't stop there as he picked him up and threw him out of the smoke for all to see. With blood dripping down his head, he stumbled to his feet. Izuku walked out of the smoke calmly again and waited for Bakugo to make another move. "Do you yield?" Izuku asked as he walked between the blonde and the edge of the ring. "Fuck you, I don't yield." Bakugo spat out. "You will." Izuku launched a spray of electricity at Bakugo. He jumped up and dodged it but was met with a kinetic strike to his face. Bakugo launched his counterattacks but they were absorbed by Izuku before they could connect with his skin. Katsuki took hit after hit while Izuku was getting more thermal energy for his core. The kinetic was being redirected back at the blonde. With the mounting heat, Bakugo was begun to dehydrate with every explosion, and every second Izuku kept releasing his thermal energy. Bakugo backed off and tried to kick Izuku out of the ring but was blinded by the light energy Izuku flashed. While blinded, Izuku grabbed the outstretched leg and used kinetic energy around his body to launch Bakugo back into the middle of the ring, hard. Bakugo struggled to get back up but he was injured, dehydrated, and tired. But his stubbornness didn't let him stop. Izuku waited for Bakugo to get up as he circled him. The crowd long had stopped cheering at the one-sided beatdown. At this point, they were watching a predator play with its prey. "Do you yield?" Izuku asked again, knowing the answer. "Fuck you," he gasped out. Izuku waited again until Bakugo made the first move, and he did with a small explosion. Izuku let it hit and absorbed what it expelled. Sweat poured off of his face, but Katsuki tried again and again to hurt Izuku in any way, but it did nothing as he absorbed anything thrown at him. He dodged the next attack and kicked Bakugo's knee as he moved. He fell to the other and Izuku held his hand aimed at his face. "Bakugo Katsuki, do you yield?" Midnight called out. Katsuki ignored the question and tried to launch another attack at Izuku, but it did nothing. He fell back to his knee but couldn't get back up. Izuku steadily increased the heat as Bakugo tried to think of anything, but the heat was too much. "Do you yield?" Izuku asked again. Bakugo opened his mouth to say something multiple times until he gritted his teeth and spoke. "I yield." With a bowed head. The heat immediately was absorbed and Izuku turned to leave the quiet arena. Bakugo knelt there as the cool air washed over him. Robots came and put him on a stretcher to get him to the nurse's station. Izuku arrived there first to get some more clothes. "Are you going to hit me again?" Izuku asked when he stepped through the doors. "What you did to that boy was unacceptable," Recovery Girl said instead. Izuku moved past her and grabbed some new clothes. "What he did to me for 10 years and then get here is unacceptable." He scowled without looking in her direction. "And are you going to keep this grudge up for 10 years? Recovery Girl shot back. "No, until he is locked away or I'm dead. And I don't plan to die anytime soon." He glared at the old woman as she took a side. She barred him from leaving with her cane. That is not very heroic behavior. Izuku looked at the cane and then at her. "Then should I stop trying to be a hero? Or should I let past sins be ignored because he has a powerful quirk?" He didn't wait for her response as he coated his hand in thermal energy and sliced through the cane. He absorbed the heat from the ends of the cane and left. Bakugo was being rolled in just at that moment and Izuku ignored the blonde who kept his eyes closed. Toru was waiting in the hallway leading to the nurse's station and his friends were farther back. Izuku didn't know how to feel about them watching him beat down Bakugo and he began to feel anxious and nervous. He looked down from Toru's worried gaze. She approached him and took his hand and guided him through the halls to the waiting room. She sat him down and she sat across from him with her hands still in his. "How do you feel?" she asked first. "I don't know." He paused and looked up to see her patiently waiting. "I feel frustrated still, scared of what you guys will think of me, and I don't know." Toru tightened her grip on his hands. "I don't blame you for what you did to Bakugo. From everything you've told me about him, he deserves it and even more. But I don't want you to go mad in pursuit of revenge. I don't want to see you lose yourself." She sniffed and Izuku looked up to see her crying with a smile. "I'm sorry, I just wanted him to feel like I did for so long." He began to cry as well. Toru got up from her seat and grabbed him in a tight hug. I know because if I could I would probably do the same in your shoes." She chucked a bit at the end. Izuku hugged her back and cried some more. "Thank you for not leaving me, for everything. You don't have to thank me every time. I'll know and that's enough for me." She pulled back and held his face with a smile while she wiped his tears with her thumbs. Izuku felt the feeling of being wanted and he would give anything to keep the feeling forever. He smiled and nodded in forever thanks. "And congratulations on winning the sports festival. I think we should all go out to eat, what do you say?" She wiped her face also as she stood up. Izuku hesitated at the thought of the others. "They won't care for what I did. The original gang knows what he did to you. Tokiyami is a bit spooked but not scared. Dark Shadow is more in awe I think." She pulled him up from the chair. "All right, I'll change and meet you guys outside." He nodded. She giggled. "You still need to do the medal ceremony." He wrinkled his nose at the idea. He opened his mouth but she beat him to the punch. "No, you can't skip it. The faster you get past it, the faster we can get something good to eat." Izuku grumbled when she answered his unasked request. Toru walked out of the waiting room and closed the door behind her. The gang plus Tokiyami were waiting across the hallway for them. They all had some variation of worry written on their faces. She spoke before any of them could ask. "He's all right, he was more worried about what we would think of him than anything else. We talked for a bit and he's better now." She explained to everyone's relief. "Good, you're good at helping him through things. Almost like your seductive charm is high." Shiro smirked at her. The invisible girl turned to glare at Kaminari, who couldn't see her angry face. "I told you not to tell people." He put up his hands in peace. "I didn't, I swear." "Then how did he know?" She jabbed a finger at Shiro. "About you having the hots for Midoriya. It wasn't hard to figure out." He shrugged. "That's cute. Good luck on ya." Jiro smiled encouragingly at her. Tokiyami nodded once. May your heart guide you true. Now everyone knows. Toru hid her face with the same effect as not hiding her face. Izuku walked out right at that time and stopped when everyone's eyes swiveled to him. What's going on? Shiro, Mina, and Kaminari in unison said. Nothing. Jiro and Tokiyami nodded in agreement. They're just messing with Hagakure, nothing to worry about. Jiro explained for his benefit with a smile. Izuku narrowed his eyes in suspicion and tried to read them but could only tell it wasn't bad. If you say so, he said unconvinced. It's fine, let's get to the medal ceremony. Toru grabbed Izuku's arm and began to drag him away from the smirking faces of their friends. The crowd cheered as Izuku stood on the podium for first place with Bakugo quietly in second and Kaminari and Tokiyami in third. Kaminari was the most animated one out of everyone on the center stage. Izuku was both happy that he had won the festival and annoyed at the ludicrous amount of ceremony. He will have to get used to it if he wants to become a hero, he suppose. Midnight walked out and began to speak into the microphone. Here are the winners of this year's UA Sports Festival. More cheering ensued and Izuku absorbed the sound around his head. And to hand out the medals, All Might. I am here. The number one hero landed with a laugh and the crowd went wild. Midnight approached with the box of medals, and he began in third place. Tokiyami took the medal graciously with words of encouragement from the hero, followed by a hug. Kaminari went next, but he had a neutral expression as he received his award. Ever since Izuku told them about his encounter with All Might, they all had some distaste for the loved hero. All Might was a bit put off by the usual jovial boy's demeanor but moved on to Bakugo. The blonde inclined his head for the silver medallion and was given the same treatment as the others. Finally, it was Izuku's turn. With a strained smile, the hero placed the gold medal on Izuku's neck, who had a neutral expression the whole time. When the hero pulled back to hug him like the others, Izuku spoke without changing expressions. If you touch me, I will release all my kinetic energy into you. The hero's face tightened. Bakugo heard and snapped his head to the two. Kaminari snorted, and Tokiyami raised his feathery eyebrows. All Might turned around to finish the ceremony. Let's finish this year with our school motto. Go beyond. Plus ultra. The crowd finished, and Izuku wasted no time and left with All Might's eyes on the back of his skull. Izuku, Kaminari, and Tokiyami regrouped with their gang, and they made their way to leave the grounds. All right, so, Toru said we were going out to eat. Where are we going? Nothing fancy, I say. She turned around and walked backward, facing them. I bid you all a good time. Tokiyami started, but Mina cut him off before he could leave. Nah, bird boy. You're part of the gang now, and that means coming to eat with us and tomfool around. Tokiyami looked at the others, and they gave their agreed with her statement. Dark Shadow popped out and nudged encouragement. If you will have me, very well. He smiled. I say McDonald's, Kaminari proposed. That's not how you pronounced it. Tokiyami looked confused at the word. But you know what I mean, so it works. The blonde shot finger guns at him. You think I can sell this? Izuku fingered the gold medal. That's a good point. What do you think it's worth? Shiro looked curious at the thought. You can't sell it, Jiro protested. I mean it's not real gold, too light. Izuku pondered as he tested the weight. Then he bit it. Don't do that, you'll hurt your teeth. Toru pulled his hand gripping the medal in his teeth. Fumi, this group seems fun. Let's stick around, Dark Shadow said with enthusiasm. Tokiyami could agree that they all seemed to have fun together. I do not see why not. He responded to his companion. The gang exited the UA gates and made their way to the nearest fast food restaurant. I think some McDonald's is good. What do you all think? Mina asked the group. That sounds good to me, I haven't had Mickey D's in a while. Jiro pulled her phone out and began to type. That reminds me to tell Mom and Dad I'm going out. That's a good point. Shiro did the same and the rest of them followed suit. Toru was the first to notice that Izuku didn't pull his phone out like the rest did. Her face creased in concern. Mina was quick with her phone and glanced around and saw the same thing. She furrowed her brows and asked, "You're not gonna tell your parents?" The gang looked over to see who Mina was talking to. It's fine. Izuku shrugged noncommittally. The gang made various faces of concern at their leader but no one pushed the subject. They walked through the door of the restaurant and began to order their food. Once done, they sat together at a table. Kaminari held up his shake in a toast. He cleared his throat. To the winner of the sports festival. Cheers. The more lively people in the group tapped their drinks with Kaminari's. Izuku felt embarrassed at the moment but nice that they would cheered his accomplishments. You all did well too. The showing you gave would have gotten you recognized. Izuku threw back the compliment. Thanks, boss. So, how did you come out with your stores? Shiro asked while everyone dug into their meals. Izuku thought for a moment and focused inward. Mostly good. I got a bit more thermal than before. Kinetic gained. Light lost, but that's no issue. Electricity is low, and sound is way up. That is a great place for sound energy. Jiro nodded in agreement. Any ideas for electric energy? Kaminari asked. There's only so much I can give you daily that I won't need. I'ma check the weather, Mina said with a smile. The gang snorted and Tokiyami looked confused. Toru looked at Jiro with a raised eyebrow. I know Tokiyami didn't know, but how do you? She spoke to Jiro. Her ears turned a bit red. It's been an instinct to eavesdrop on a convention when someone shouts, "You did what?" I don't spread what anyone says unless it's illegal stuff, but I've heard some great conversations. You all guys at the cafeteria did the same and I listened in, sorry. She sheepishly apologized. It's fine, it wasn't like a secret or something. Izuku waved it away. So what was it? Dark Shadow asked with a fry between their hands. Our illustrious leader here didn't have enough electrical energy for the exam. So on one stormy night, he decided to stand under the lightning storm and get stuck by the lightning, multiple times. Mina pulled the news article from that day and showed it to Tokiyami. Incredible. When you decide to perform this again? I wish to be a witness. Tokiyami looked awestruck and Dark Shadow nodded in agreement with his companion. Yes, we'll make it a group activity, sadly no lightning storms anytime soon. Mina deflated at the end. I'm thinking about visiting that Hatsume girl in the support course. Maybe she can make a stationary generator or even give me new energies to try. Izuku shrugged and bit into his burger. They finished their food and headed to the park near the woods they trained at. Toru linked arms with Izuku and they walked in a group talking about the festival. Even if some didn't get to place in the tournament, they all had some fun with it. They arrived at the park and found an empty spot to digest their food. I mean, Midoriya could have wiped the floor against all of us. Shiro pointed out. That's not true, I have my weaknesses. I just do my best to counter them. Izuku knew he was strong, but he knew what could beat him if he wasn't careful. Like what? Jiro asked unconvinced. I'm not going to tell you, you can figure it out. It's really simple. Izuku crossed his arms and smiled at them. Of course, you are lactose intolerant, Kaminari said sagely. No, you dollar store battery, his weaknesses are invisible girl. Mina smirked at the two linked arms, only one was visible but it wasn't hard to tell. Izuku blushed and Toru tightened her grip on his arm while glaring at the pink girl without much effect. The group laughed at his reaction and Shiro gave them a lifeline. So what's your weakness? With still pink ears he answered. Capturing me in any way. Like that guy in 1B who can make the ground soften, he could trap me. Granted, I could burn or blast my way out, but without energy I'm average. Jiro nodded in understanding. That makes sense. You still would have plans to get out anyway if that ever happened. Of course I do. Only a half dozen, but one should work. Oh, that entrance to the last match was awesome. It was a top-tier hero landing. Kaminari changed the topic without any tact. Yes, that looked awesome. They replayed it on the big screen while Bakugo arrived, and it looked choreographed. Mina got up on the bench and tried to mimic him. I already have a hero entrance. Shiro boasted. Show us, Kaminari ordered. Shiro got up on the bench but Izuku stopped them. Let's go into the woods if you want to try your quirk out. The group agreed and Tokiyami followed into the woods. Doesn't this remind you of that manga we read? Dark Shadow asked Tokiyami. Jiro snorted and turned to the two. I asked the same thing when they brought me here. So no dark rituals? Dark Shadow asked morosely. I'm sure we can make one up if you want. Mina waved her arms like a witch casting a spell. The gang sat near a tree that had a branch they could climb easily for their demonstration. All right, Here I go, Zero announced. He swung on a tape ribbon and rolled to a stop. How was that? The group clapped politely. That was great. Very on point, although no catchphrase. Izuku complimented. Nah, I'll say whatever comes to mind at the time. Saying the same thing over and over seems very dull to me. I'm next. Mina got up and ran behind the group. They heard running, then the sound of acid on the ground. She came in sliding on acid and ran up with a smile. I still got to think of a catchphrase or something. They clapped again. It was very cutesy if that was your aim, Juro said. Toru got up next and ran behind. Everyone faces forward. They heard some clothes ruffling and then they saw a quick flash of light in the shape of a girl. I see you, can you see me? She said seriously. Oh ho, that was badass. Mina clapped and the rest followed with her blushing for only Izuku to see, and he gave her an encouraging smile. Tokiyami, DS, you're up, Kaminari said pointing at the two. Tokiyami looked unsure but Dark Shadow looked excited. Come on Fumi, the quirk encouraged. The bird-headed boy agreed, apprehensive in every step. They heard a thump and Tokiyami landed in a crouch with Dark Shadow roiling behind him. The dark comes to take you back where you came from. Just imagine that we had our costume on with the cloak. Dark Shadow added. The group clapped hard at that demonstration. That was one of the best ones. Zero said. Tokiyami got up and looked sheepish but the fluffed feathers gave his embarrassment away. We practiced that a lot. Another one is us emerging from an alleyway in the same fashion. Dark Shadow boasted for the two of them. I thank you all for your input. He bowed to them all. Juro. Mina pointed at her and she shook her head. I don't have anything, she tried to say. Make something up, come on. Toru encouraged. All right. Juro jogged to the tree and climbed to the branch. She leapt off and landed with her earlobes getting plugged into the ground and releasing a sound wave through the ground. Let the bass drop, she said with a red face. I liked that, and the sound wave was an awesome addition. Kaminari clapped the loudest. The catchphrase was good too. Mina encouraged. Juro got up with red cheeks and a smile. Thanks, alright Sparky is next. The best for last. Midoriya sits in front just in case I lose too much. Kaminari climbed the tree branch and Izuku sat in front of everyone ready to absorb any electricity coming at him. They heard some footsteps on the branch then. Oh shit, Kaminari fell out of the tree and bodily hit the ground with sparks arcing around him. He moaned face down as the gang exploded in laughter at their friend. Izuku moved forward to check on his friend but couldn't contain his laughter. Kaminari, you okay? He said between breaths. My pride, he moaned out. The friends laughed harder at that and Kaminari joined in shortly after because of the situation he saw. Izuku was being leaned on by Toru who was wheezing in breaths and Izuku was trying to control himself but failed. Zero was on his side almost crying. Mina was on her knees clutching her stomach with tears coming out of her eyes while laughing. Juro held her face as her shoulders shook and Tokiyami covered his mouth hole looking away. Dark Shadow didn't hold back and laughed the hardest. After they all calmed down, they saw the sun begin to set, and they decided to head home. They split off at the train station after getting Tokiyami in their group chat and Toru giving Izuku his hug. Izuku headed to the apartment with a smile and a gold medal in his pocket. The weekend after the sports festival flew by with Izuku doing some light training and some more heavy quirk training. He wanted to do more with his quirk but as far as he could tell, all his quirk did was take in and release. He could control how much he could take in or how much to release but that was his limit. It was a simple quirk with complicated factors. He also tried to merge energies like sound and thermal but the only useful combination was thermal and electric to make plasma and then kinetic and thermal to blast fire like a fireball. The weekend passed and Izuku headed to Ua again for classes to begin. He got many looks while riding the train from other passengers, he did his best to ignore them. The walk to school was quiet and made it to his class without issue. His friends greeted him and he talked for a bit until Aizawa walked into the class. Welcome back, hope you had a good weekend because I didn't. He complained at the podium. Moving on, the reason we have to sports festival is to get you all real-life experience by getting internships sent by heroes who saw your performance. Here are your invitations. He showed a projection with everyone's invitations. He called Iida and Yaoyorozu to hand out everyone's offers. Todoroki was on top with almost 5,000 offers. Next was Bakugo at 2,000 and then Izuku at 1,000. The rest got lower than 1,000. Kaminari got 400 to his surprise. Why is Midoriya at third and Todoroki at first? Kirishima asked with his offers in hand. Todoroki was about to explain but Izuku beat him to it. Because of his connection to the number 2 hero. And I didn't help my image with the last match. Todoroki nodded in agreement. Izuku was flipping through his thick stack quietly analyzing each name he could recognize. He stopped at the name of Endeavor on the second page. With a raised eyebrow he turned to Todoroki. Your father gave me an offer, he said with a questioning brow. Todoroki scrunched his nose slightly. Me too. That's all he said. Izuku wasn't sure if Todoroki has started to use his fire or not but Izuku did his best so he did. If he didn't then he shouldn't be a hero. Endeavor reminds Izuku a lot of Bakugo but he is supposed to go to get experience and who else to learn from than the number 2. He will milk this opportunity as much as he can. After all, he can't get full in thermal energy anyways. He circled Endeavor as the top possibility and continued to search. One more thing, hero codenames. I'm not creative so she is doing it. Aizawa rolled into his sleeping bag and Midnight slammed the door open and strolled in. That's right, and you better choose wisely or else it will stick. She jabbed a thumb at the napping form of their homeroom teacher and got a few chuckles out of it. She handed out whiteboards and they began to brainstorm for ideas. Izuku just thought of his quirk and what it did. He wanted a short name he could recognize. He capped his marker and set his whiteboard face down with his name. Kaminari turned around to show Izuku his. Too much of a mouthful. Izuku said it slowly like he was tasting the word. Chargebolt. No, I think it's good. Toru erased the name and leaned back. She looked around and spotted Izuku flipping through his internship offers. She caught Bakugo in the corner of her eye sitting quietly and she made a face at him with no one knowing. She turned back to Izuku and he was covering his mouth and staring straight at her. Her face bloomed in heat at being caught. She grabbed her whiteboard and snuck over to him. Izuku snorted just a bit as she arrived at his side. Stop it, she whispered yelled at him. I'm sorry, just. His shoulders shook a bit and he covered his mouth. How many times have you done that? More than once, she giggled and then got to the matter at hand. I need help with my name. Alright, what kind of name do you want? Something short or to have some meaning? He asked. Show me yours maybe I'll get an idea. She tried to peek at his whiteboards but Izuku held it down. You'll see it with everyone. Plus it's not all that. She pulled her hand back and pouted. Fine then. She did smile when she caught his blush when he looked at her face. You going to flirt all class? Jiro leaned back and whispered into her ear. Laughed when she was batted away by Toru's hands. Shiro heard it all since he was right next to Izuku and behind Jiro. He turned to Izuku to see his reaction and was satisfied when he had red ears. He turned to Shiro and he moved his eyebrows suggestively. Izuku blushed only more at his insinuation. Toru slapped his arm when she caught the action and turned to Izuku. So will you help me? Toru asked the flustered boy. He cleared his throat and nodded with a smile. Of course, I'll help you. Alright, who wants to go first? Midnight clapped her hands to get everyone's attention. Aoyama walked first to present his long hero name. It was rejected and he sat back down to work on it. Kaminari was next with his name of Chargebolt proudly presented. Name after name went up with Bakugo's name getting rejected and Mina's as well. Toru went up and turned hers around to show the name, Prisms. That's a good one, approved. Midnight said and Toru beamed at Izuku. As people went up and presented their names, Mina scurried over to their gang leader. Midori, help, she whined. Are you sure? She looked at him with narrowed eyes. You helped Toru, or is she different to you than I am to you? She had a devious smile on her face and it grew as his face grew hot once again. Izuku didn't know what to say and Kaminari saved him by shocking her arm. Leave him be, you don't want to ruin it. He whispered the last part in her ear. Mina nodded in agreement. Sorry, Midoriya, got any ideas? Izuku got himself under control and pushed the thoughts plaguing his mind for later. A few ideas if you want. Mina walked to the podium and presented her whiteboard. Acid Queen. She smiled. Izuku walked to the podium and showed what he had chosen. Flux. It suits you well, approved. Midnight nodded with less enthusiasm than the others. He had left a lasting image when she had to watch him break Bakugo until he gave up. The day progressed as normal with everyone looking through their internship offers. At lunch, everyone ate more or less quietly while they flipped through their packets or a few leaves of paper. Izuku finished eating and got up to head to the support department. The gang offered to join but Izuku turned them down. They came anyways after quickly eating. They arrived at the support department and there was a plume of black smoke coming out of the open door. Izuku knocked at the doorframe as Power Loader tried to smother a flame that wouldn't go out. What is this? Hatsume. Is this thermite? He was yelling at the pink-haired girl with goggles on her eyes and writing frantically on a clipboard. Izuku walked up and absorbed the thermal energy until it was smothered. Power Loader stared at the black stain on the, still intact, metal table. What were you thinking of lighting thermite inside the workshop? He turned to Hatsume who stopped writing and stared at the previous burning spot. You shouldn't be able to put that out. How'd you do it? She zipped over and got too close for Izuku's comfort. Ow. She was zapped on her lip when she didn't back off. Don't crowd me, I came to ask about getting something built. Izuku stepped away from the excitable girl while Toru glared at her. Mina and Jiro waved in greeting. Build. What do you need? Hatsume Industries will make sure it's built better than anyone could. Hatsume got in Izuku's space again and she was zapped harder. Stop that. Stop getting so close to me. Izuku shrugged noncommittally and looked to Power Loader. Whatcha need? The hero pulled Hatsume away from the rumored unstable boy. Something that generates a large amount of electricity. Something stationary is fine, I don't want to lug it around. Izuku asked. Also, do you have any other energies I could? He paused to search for words. Taste. The gang snorted at his description. Taste. Explain to me what you need it all for. Hatsume was also listening carefully. Izuku explained his quirk and Hatsume ran off with wide eyes. That makes sense. Where else could you get electricity without a dedicated source? He nodded. As for others, he was cut off by Hatsume running up to him and putting something in Izuku's hands. Izuku took the metal tube and switched to his sixth sense. He felt energy shooting off of it and he grabbed some and took it into his core. He felt the new energy settle into its new home. He looked up just as Power Loader asked the question. What's this? He held out the metal tube. Power Loader flinched away and shouted. That's concentrated nuclear isotopes. Put it down gently. He didn't get closer. Oh fuck. Izuku quickly stepped away from his friends and absorbed all the energy contained in the container. He turned on his sixth sense and nothing was left except the container. He turned a glare at the pink-haired girl. It would have been nice to know what you gave me. You absorbed it, didn't you? So it's fine, gimme. She took the container and unscrewed the top. A metal rod slipped out into her gloved hands as she examined it. Hatsume, put that down this instant. Hearing the tone of voice of her teacher she listened without arguing. Power Loader dug a device out of a cabinet and passed it over the rod and then Izuku, it never went off. You won't find any radiation, I absorbed all the energy once I found out what it was. The hero set the device aside and took Izuku's hand where he held the container. The boy held himself from pulling away and let the teacher examine for any abnormalities. He hesitated and grabbed the device. Released a drop of it, aimed down. Izuku did so and the device crackled loudly and then died down. That answers if you can absorb nuclear. Kaminari said from behind. He was hit quickly. All right, no joking. That's incredible. Power Loader mumbled to himself as Hatsume picked up the rod and began to test it in various ways. Izuku, you feel all right? Toru tapped his arm. He looked at her and saw her concern. I feel fine. He smiled for her comfort. Although, I think I have a cancer ray now. Izuku felt the newest energy in his core, nuclear. Oh, let's hit Bakugo with it. Mina said evilly. She was bopped between the horns. Ow. Fake tears cropped up as she looked at Izuku. No giving cancer to people, maybe. That will be Plan C. Kaminari nodded and Tokiyami looked concerned at what they were saying. Jiro nodded her head as the new development cropped up. She wonders if she could make a song out of it. Power Loader scanned Izuku up and down to make sure he didn't leak any nuclear energy. He drew some blood and tested it, but nothing came from the results. Looks like you're clear. Let me know if you have any issues. Izuku furrowed his brow in slight anger. Yes, I'll let you know if your student gave me poisoning of some kind. While he was glad he had another energy to play with, he didn't like the risk of exposure to cancerous materials. Granted, he is practically immune to it, but before, not so much. Izuku headed out of the room and to the gates of the school. He looked at his phone and read the messages from his friends. They all split to head to their homes and would see him tomorrow. He smiled at the cutesy emoji Toru sent him at the end. He didn't have any plans for the day, so he got to the apartment and saw he had a package for himself. It was his work clothes. He tore the box open and checked his new clothes out. It was 2 sets of clothes. Shorts, shirts, and 1 pair of thin shoes, he kept with the black color. He put them on and headed out to experiment with the newest energy in his core. He wasn't exactly sure what nuclear energy could do, but he will have to be careful with how much he uses. While the isotope contained a large amount of energy, it would be harder to obtain than any other. He sat at the clearing and focused on the nuclear energy. He looked around and felt none. It was to be expected. Next, he released a small amount on some leaves, both to see the effect of nuclear energy on living matter and to see how the energy moves. The leaves didn't move, but the green color drained slightly. As for the energy itself, it was erratic, more so than electricity. Electricity wanted to go anywhere with the lowest negative charge or the path of least resistance. Nuclear energy shot out in any direction it could, as the light energy did. While his release was focused, the edges leaked energy. He absorbed the lingering energy and hummed to himself in thought. Using pure nuclear energy offensively would be bad. But maybe combining it with another might show some results, the safest ones first. Light, sound, kinetic, and electricity didn't combine well. Lighting was the only one to show a difference, with the electricity changing color to a bluish hue. The burn marks on the tree didn't show any difference, and he didn't have instruments to measure its power. Thermal, on the other hand, showed incredible results. The basic flames mixed with the nuclear energy and burned hotter than would be safe. It wasn't normal flames anymore, but a nuclear fire. He shot it at a tree and the air screamed as it boiled. It was closer to a laser beam, as the part of the trunk was turned to ash in a moment. The tree fell and Izuku absorbed the flames that lingered on the trunk. He got more thermal energy than he released just from those flames alone. The ambient thermal energy also was high from the released energy. Super lethal, noted, Izuku said to himself. He looked at the fell tree and shrugged. More energy couldn't hurt. It turned to ash the next minute. The rest of the week passed without much to speak about. Everyone handed in their internship paperwork and the class met up at the train station to split off. 1A all had their suitcases as Aizawa spoke. "Don't cause trouble, now be gone." He left with that. Izuku's gang said their goodbyes and Toru gave him a hug that lingered longer than usual. The rest gang elbowed each other with smirks. "I'll see you later, Izuku." She smiled at him and headed to her train. Izuku followed Todoroki to another train and boarded it. He sat across from him and put his headphones on. The elemental boy didn't try to speak to Izuku as they rode in silence. He wondered how his time in the number 2 Heroes Agency will go. He is aware of the multiple heroes and sidekicks Endeavor employed, and Izuku was excited to see if he could absorb any new energies he came across. They arrived at their stop and they walked off. Todoroki didn't wait for Izuku to catch up and headed to Endeavor's agency like he had been there before, which isn't hard to believe. Many heroes walked in and put as they arrived. Todoroki walked up to the receptionist and she gave him a card. Izuku walked up to the woman and she crossed his name off a list. She handed him the same card for the elevator and Izuku went to follow Todoroki again. They walked out of the elevator into a set of double doors with flame motifs on them. Izuku huffed in amusement at the unoriginal design. Endeavor stood waiting behind the doors with crossed arms. Izuku raised an eyebrow at the dramatic show. "You finally arrived, good. Go change into your hero suits and meet me in the gym." "Shoto, show him." With that, he left through the doors. Shoto let out a small sigh of announced and began to walk down the hallway. "This way." They arrived in a large locker room with lockers lining the wall and benches on the other side. Shoto went to an empty locker and began to change. Izuku took an empty one and did the same. Once he put on his tank top, he grabbed his jacket and put it on. He smelled a lingering perfume from Toru. Izuku smiled and the tips of his ears felt hot at the moment. The two trainees walked into a private gym with Endeavor and Burnin waiting. So this is the winner, huh? You don't seem all that. Burnin began as she examined Izuku. Izuku did the same to her, but there was no need as he already read the profile he has on her. Burnin or Mo Kamiji, age 25, a graduate of Shikatsu High School in the high middle of her class. Applied to Endeavor's agency 6 times until hired on the 7th at a low position and worked your way up to Endeavor's 2nd in 5 years. Quirk is blazing hair, which allows the user to manipulate the fire pulled from the flaming hair to various forms. Usually positive personality with a very enthusiastic attitude for everything. Did I miss anything? Her smile waned as she stepped back slightly. How do you know all that? What freaked her out the most was how he knew about the 6 denied applications. I like to have information, Izuku said and turned to Endeavor. On everyone I can. That's a good trait to have. Explain your quirk to me. Endeavor commanded. I absorb energies, store them, and release them. He explained simply. What kinds of energies? Endeavor looked intriguing now. Thermal, kinetic, electric, sound, light, and now nuclear. Everyone snapped their heads to the last one. Nuclear. Burnin asked. I can absorb any energy as long as I've come in contact with it. A support department student gave me a contained nuclear isotope in her excitement about the experiment. What is your limit on the quantity and different amounts of energy you can store? Endeavor continues his questions. None as far as I can tell. He shrugged. Impossible, there has to be a limit on both. Endeavor scoffed. Test me then. Throw everything you have and I'll take it all. Izuku baited. He stared at Izuku for a moment and then. Very well, you two, go to the viewing room. Burnin looked somewhat apprehensive. Don't go too hard on the kid. She joked. They walked to a door and walked through it into a thick treated glass window to watch. You know Midoriya better than me. How do you think he'll do? Shoto stared out the glass at Izuku, who was neatly folding his jacket and setting it to the side. He is strong, but I don't know if what he said was the truth. With the last word spoken, the room turned into a hellscape. Endeavor stared at the calm boy across from him. Say yelled when you cannot continue. He prepared a simple blast of flames. You do the same, Izuku goaded. The flames on the hero's hands grew hotter and blasted toward him. Before the flames got halfway to him, they were condensed into streams of fire and absorbed into Izuku's body. He hadn't moved from his position. The next blast came without hesitation, but the same result happened. The room began to get hotter and hotter as Endeavor poured heavier attacks at Izuku. He began to run around Izuku as he blasted superheated fire at the boy, but he still didn't move or counterattack. That irked Endeavor and began to use super moves on him, but the flame constructs fell apart as they got close to the calm boy. Izuku's core continued to absorb the thermal energy Endeavor was freely giving away. Before, if he released all the thermal energy at once, he could turn the building and some of the surroundings into slag. Now, maybe a block radius more. He could see Endeavor begin to get annoyed at his still position. Will you stand there or do something? Endeavor growled. Okay, I fight back. The room began to drain of heat and frost spread from Izuku's feet. Where he stood was now a small crater as Izuku was launched straight to Endeavor. The veteran hero saw it coming and threw a flaming punch at the boy. His fist collided with Izuku's shoulder and came to a dead stop as if it was gently placed there. The flames on his fist wavered and snuffed out as they streamed into Izuku. The raised fist that Izuku had pulled back hit Endeavor in the face, but the true damage was from the kinetic blast afterwards. Izuku poured about 3 times what Endeavor would have hit Izuku with and threw it back in his face. Something cracked and Endeavor was thrown back. The hero reeled back and felt something in his mouth. He spat it out and saw the white enamel of his molar with his blood. In a rage, he released a large amount of fire from his body that normally would have melted the stone in the specialized room, but the flames never reached anywhere other than where he stood. The rest were sucked into Izuku's body where he walked to the raging hero. Endeavor began to feel cold instead of the ever-present heat in his body. He saw why. The room was filled with frost instead of sweltering heat. The only spot where there wasn't frost was under Endeavor's feet, but it was getting closer by the second. The hero began to feel the beginning of quirk exhaustion. Izuku was pulling more thermal energy from the hero's body by force. Izuku raised his hand and aimed it at Endeavor's chest and then looked at the number 2 hero and waited. A small bead of blinding light was contained in his hand and it radiated heat. Izuku tilted his head as if to ask a question but never spoke. Endeavor stared at the boy with enough raw power to beat the number 2 hero without breaking a sweat. He was sure if he gave enough reason the boy would fire whatever he had contained in his hand. That is enough for today. Have Burnin show you the building. Shoto, begin your regime. Izuku closes his hand and the bead of pure thermal energy was absorbed back into his core. In the viewing room, Shoto stared at the boy who beat the number 2 hero with ease. Burnin had a smile, but underneath she was slightly pale. Normally she would be pumped up at the power Midoriya showed, but the look in his eye, as he waited for Endeavor to end the spar, was spine-chilling. On top of his last match against Bakugo in the sports festival showed something darker in the boy's mind. Izuku shook his jacket to get rid of the frost clinging to it. He put it back on and looked at the aftermath of his bout with Endeavor. The concrete was warped from the intense heat and then absolute cold. Shoto gave him a nod and split off from Burnin, who walked out of a door that led to stairs. Burnin had a strained smile when she met up with him. Now that was a match to remember. She tried to slap his shoulder but it stopped dead as soon as it touched him, which unnerved her even more. Come on, let's give you the prime tour. Izuku nodded and followed her. He observed her hair flickering like normal flames. He wondered what would happen if he absorbed the flames from her quirk. Would she go into quirk exhaustion and then to death if he continued to pull? It was a dark thought, but his curiosity was definitely piqued. They walked through the large building with Burnin stopping every once in a while to show Izuku a room or area. She showed him the communications room, weight room, Izuku's and Shoto's rooms for the week, and finally the cafeteria. It was a large room that covered most of the 5th floor. Over a dozen heroes sat and ate or chatted with each other. Izuku recognized many of them, but the rest were too new to the game to have information about them. The two began to walk to the line for some food, but one hero called out and Burnin cursed softly under her breath. What's up, second? Showing the newbie around. What's his deal? A cocky male hero with a skin-tight blue and red suit began to speak. Izuku observed him for a second and already knew Izuku wouldn't like him. The smirk on his face aimed at Burnin and him just made it more punchable. Burnin seemed to think the same. Yes, Flamebar, this is actually I never got your hero name. She turned to Izuku. My name is Izuku Midoriya, hero name, Flux. He introduced himself to Flamebar. Flux is a classmate of Shoto that came to intern with Endeavor. Flux. That's a pretty weird name. He snorted with derision. Ain't you the same brat that won the sports festival? Yeah, you beat that last kid until he gave up. That's pretty villainous. He leaned forward in an attempt to intimidate Izuku. Izuku stared blankly at him. Then do something about it. You're a hero, you're supposed to stop any villainous behavior. Or are you one of those heroes that are in for it for the fame and glory? He stared at Flamebar's angering eyes. Maybe you should. And while I'm at it, beat some respect into you. He rose and grabbed Izuku by his jacket collar. Izuku noticed Burnin wasn't doing anything. Fine, he'll deal with it. Izuku gripped the hero's hand and began to absorb kinetic energy. After all, the body is kept moving by kinetic energy from the beating heart to the flowing blood. So Izuku began to slowly absorb what little kinetic energy there was naturally in the body. Flamebar eyes began to flutter and breathing slowed. What are you doing to me? He slurred out. Let go of my jacket. He ordered. Instead of listening, Flamebar activated his quirk, and flames from his shoulders began to spread to his hands. They stopped at his elbows and turned into streams of thermal energy. He tried to punch Izuku with his other hand, but it landed without impact on his face. Finally, he let go of his jacket and Izuku gripped him harder. You seem tired. Sit down. He moved so Flamebar fell back into his seat while Izuku kept his grip on his hands. With a nod, he let go of his hands and Flamebar gasped for breath. His heart began to beat normally and blood flowed how it should. What the hell was that? He gasped for breath while still trying to ignite his arms. Every time they did, they turned into streams of thermal energy that got sucked into Izuku's body. Don't touch me next time. Izuku turned to leave and was met by Burnen's furrowed brow. We don't use our quirks unless it's necessary, she said sternly. Endeavor doesn't seem to care for that rule with his flame beard. And you didn't seem to care for my little interaction with Flamebar, Izuku said without much care for her anger toward him. That's how it goes around here, you're the new guy and someone hazes you. She argued back and didn't even try to argue for Endeavor's blatant quirk use. He tried and failed. Anything else? When she didn't respond, he moved past her to get in line for some food. He noticed then that the whole cafeteria was quiet as they stared at him. A small few gave nods of approval but most watched him. He was fine with that and ignored the ones who had furrowed brows aimed at him. The line began to move again and Izuku got his plate of food. It tasted all right. Burnen sat across from him but didn't speak again. Once finished, he waited for her to finish eating and then spoke. Who do I talk to about hand-to-hand combat? That's one thing he couldn't learn on his own. She looked up at him and then jerked her head in the direction of a woman with a tight hair bun and a serious expression. She's the best hand combative hero here, but she won't teach anyone. Izuku got up and went to talk to her. I am Flux, an intern here for the week. Will you teach me hand-to-hand? No, she said curtly. Who is the second best after you then? Endeavor. With a nod, he turned to head to the elevator. But she stopped him by raising her hand. You won't try to convince me to train you. No, it would be a waste of time. If you wanted to train someone you would have. He turned back and walked to the elevator to ask Endeavor for hand-to-hand training. Izuku didn't wait for Burnen to follow as he pushed the button for the top floor where Endeavor's office was. Arriving, he saw it was empty, so he returned to the elevator and went down to the gym. He found Endeavor sparring with Shoto, and by the looks of it, it was brutal. Shoto did his best to fight back against his father, but the veteran hero didn't give any ground. Izuku stood to the side and waited for their fight to finish. He saw many martial arts put to use. He recognized some, but he didn't have practice in the arts. Finally, Endeavor knocked Shoto down, and he lay there for a moment. Endeavor turned to Izuku. What is it you want? Training in hand-to-hand fighting. Where is Burnen? He furrowed his brow. I left her in the cafeteria. She pointed me to another, but she refused to train me. So I came to you for training. What training have you had before? None. I wasn't allowed in training classes. Izuku wasn't going to hide his previous status anymore. If they scorned him, he would deal with it one way or another. It gave no benefit for hiding it, and revealing it will allow him to see what kind of person he is speaking with. Why is that? Endeavor did read Izuku's profile, which contained what had happened in the USJ and his resulting psychological evaluation request. His admittance of not being allowed into a training center made him think of his rumored, unstable nature. Not to mention his last showing at the sports festival. Quirkless aren't allowed in them. I am a late bloomer. He saw the younger Todoroki was paying rapt attention to him. How late? Endeavor continued. Last year. He watched Endeavor, and he couldn't read his expression. Shoto, on the other hand, was shocked. And you've managed to control your quirk in this short of time, incredible. He said it more to himself than Izuku. Shoto, take a break. I wish to see what Flux has in him. He dismissed his son without looking. The rest of the day was grueling for Izuku. His previous training helped him keep up to a point, but he didn't have any formal training in anything. Endeavor didn't hold back as he threw Izuku left and right. Thankfully, Izuku could absorb the impacts, but his muscles will still be sore the next day. After a shower, he walked into the room set for him and Shoto. The other boy was already on his bed reading as Izuku came in with a damp towel on his head. He sat and checked his phone for the group chat. Everyone seems to be having fun with their internship with pictures sent through the app. He smiled to himself as he saw Toru's selfie with her interned hero. He was brought out of his thoughts by Shoto speaking. What was it like growing up quirkless? Izuku looked up and saw the curiosity. Hell, the scars I have are from others using their quirks on me because if I reported them they could get away with it. From teachers to police, They didn't care for a quirkless person, a fourth-rate citizen. Grades were marked lower to make the quirk look better than me. You can imagine the rest. Fourth-rate citizen. I thought the expression was, second-rate citizen. I was at the bottom. You were on the top. If you wanted to go out there and study to be whatever you wanted, you could. I would have been rejected because what's better? Someone with the same grades but one had a quirk. Who do you think they'll choose? Izuku held no scorn for Shoto's better life compared to his, but he wanted to use it as an example. He scowled slightly. My life wasn't as good as you think. I wasn't talking about your home life, I was talking about how you could go out without anyone batting an eye at you. I don't know what your home life was like, but outside you could walk the streets without a kid your age jumping on you and the police looking the other way. Oh, Shoto realized immediately after. Was your home better? I was never hurt, he said simply. Shoto was quiet for a moment and then spoke. He explained about his father setting up a quirk marriage with his mother's family for the money. How his mother poured boiling water on his face and how his father trained him to the bone to surpass All Might. Izuku snorted and Shoto shot a questioning brow at him. You don't like All Might, why? Shoto asked. He saved me from a villain and then he shot my idea of being a hero like a dying dog. Not once did he ever apologize or speak about it again. All he does is glare at me for making it, or maybe thinking I hid my quirk or something. He shrugged and huffed a laugh. That was the same day I got my quirk too. Shoto took all that in and sat in silence. I guess we both have pretty bad luck with life. You still have a sister and brother you can connect with, I say try to. You still have family, have you ever visited your mother? He felt a pang of loneliness from mentioning family, but he ruthlessly shoved it down. I did. I didn't know how she would react when she saw me. She was happy to see me, it was nice. As for my siblings, how? He had a faint smile thinking of his mother. Talk to them. Izuku shrugged. You have some experience compared to me with that. I'll think about it. Midoriya, yay, thank you for getting me to use my fire. Happy to be able to help someone. Izuku lay down to get some sleep. The next came without much fanfare. Izuku woke at the same time Shoto did and got ready for his daily routine. Izuku went to the gym that Burnin showed him and began his warm-ups and moved to a treadmill. Some other heroes joined him in the gym, but Izuku ignored them all. At one point, Endeavor walked into the gym to look for his other intern. He stepped in front of the treadmill and Izuku took off his earbuds. Izuku kept his running pace as he spoke. Yes, once you finish, meet me on floor 8 to continue your hand-to-hand training. With that, he left. The absorber sped up his pace to begin the end of the routine and go meet the number 2 hero. Endeavor finished up with Shoto and turned to Izuku. He got in the stance Endeavor showed him yesterday and he nodded in approval. For 3 hours, Izuku learned how to properly fight with his body. His body ached, but he soaked everything Endeavor threw at him. That's enough for now, go get cleaned up. You have an hour and a half and then we go on a patrol. Endeavor commanded. Izuku nodded and jogged off to the showers to get changed into his hero suit. He went to the cafeteria and got a meal so he could focus properly. He took a food bar and put it in his pouch where his ball bearing was for later. He still hadn't had a chance to use them against anyone. The Nomu at the USJ would have been useless, but Shigaraki and Kurogiri would have been a different story. He finished his meal and went back to the elevator to Endeavor's office to wait to head out. Shoto was there already waiting with Burnin and a few other of Endeavor's sidekicks. The number 2 hero was mapping out a route for them with the pro heroes around him. Once done, Endeavor led them to the ground floor and out in the streets. Endeavor began to walk in a direction with everyone following him. Burnin began to explain what in particular they should keep an eye out for. How they should hold themselves. It was a bit hard for her to get the 2 serious boys to smile for the people, but it only led to failure on her part. We split off here, Shoto with me. Flux, go with Burnin and follow her directions. Endeavor led Shoto off in the opposite direction at an intersection. Flux and Burnin began to patrol the route Endeavor gave them. It was quiet as people walked around on their business and a few waved at them. So tell me, why are you always so angry looking? Or is that just your face? She laughed to break the ice. Do you really want to know, or are you just trying to make small talk? Izuku asked with his head in a swivel. His sixth sense was turned on for everything but nothing came of it. I have some idea how Shoto was trained and why he is the way he is. But you are different, I'm just curious. She smiled and waved at a kid with his mother. What do you know of how quirkless people are treated? Izuku began. She furrowed her brows. Bad and getting worse last time I saw the statistics, why? I just got my quirk last year and yes it was bad, to say the least. When I first found out about my quirk, I contemplated wiping my old school off the map with everyone inside. I didn't do that. Instead, I turned in all the evidence to the police, and the next day Aldera was raided and teachers were thrown in jail for what they've done. Izuku said coldly and reminiscent of that day in the library. You went to Aldera. You were the one who gave the information to the news stations and police. You ruined every adult that worked in that school, even if they got out of jail. Vernon saw the boy next to him in a new light. She had read the reports of what caused the raid to start but never imagined meeting who they were based on or who turned them in. I'm sorry, she said to him. Izuku turned to her and observed her for a moment. He saw earnestness and pity which he ignored. You have nothing to apologize for. He turned back and kept walking on the route. Right, she said softly, and then she smiled. Let's go beat up some bad guys. In an attempt to cheer him up. If we find any, I suppose that's a good sign. Or bad one if they are bidding their time. Now you're getting it, newbie. She clapped his shoulder and the impact was absorbed. Whoa, freaky, let's go. She marched forward. They walked around the neighborhood with nothing of note happening until they turned a corner and found three men trying to pry a door open on a closed shop with a crowbar. They were too busy arguing among themselves to realize they were spotted. The three of them were nondescript with black masks hiding their facial features. Make sure no civilians are hurt in the crossfire and only use your quirk in defense of someone else. Now, watch how the pros do it. She cracked her knuckles and tore two pieces of her hair off and merged them to make a green burning whip. She lashed out and caught the closest one to the street. With a yank, he was thrown back and landed at her feet. With a punch to his forehead, we went unconscious. The other two panicked at seeing a pro but gained confidence when they only saw her alone. You boys shouldn't be doing what you're doing. Why don't you come with me for a chat? She smiled at the two would-be robbers. Izuku put himself between a small crowd that showed up at the commotion and pushed them back when they began to get too close. The crowd grumbled when Izuku did so but listened anyways. The three clashed. One robber used the crowbar and the other began to use his quirk that summoned a golden sword made of light. Vernon dropped the whip and molded a staff to push the two back. Izuku watched carefully as the fight continued. Vernon pushed them back and knocked them down with two finishing blows each. The first guy she knocked out on the other hand. The robber got up from his position of faking and threw three globs of something glowing at Izuku and the crowd. Flux caught two that hit and stuck to Izuku, the third landed on a woman. The quirk didn't do anything other than glowed green with a pulse. The hero in training tried to grab the one on the woman but it was stuck on her. Stay back hero or I detonate them. The man yelled at Vernon. Izuku immediately grabbed the woman and dragged her away from the crowd. He began to look at the bombs and saw nothing other than their shape. Then he switched to his sixth sense and he could feel it. He turned to the woman who was crying and shaking. He ignored the man still talking to Vernon and focused on the bomb on the woman. He got a hold of the energy and yanked it to himself. The green glob turned into a green stream and was drawn into Izuku's body. Go. He pushed her to the crowd and then focused on the ones on his body. He absorbed everything with that energy without hesitation and they disappeared. And just like before, new energy settled in his core. I said stay back. Vernon saw what Flux had done and began to run at him. The would-be robber backed away and snapped his fingers. When nothing happened he stared dumbly at his fingers, then he whipped his head around to look at the boy who he threw the bombs at. They were gone. The next thing he knew, he was on the ground, and darkness overtook him. The crowd cheered at Vernon's takedown. The whole incident took less than 5 minutes in total. Vernon smiled and waved the crowd and then made her way over to Flux after making sure the three robbers were tied together. She put a hand on his shoulder and said, I couldn't have done it alone. Flux, a first-year UA student, was here to assist me. Police began to push through the crowd and one approached Vernon and Flux. Before the policeman could say anything, Burnin turned to Izuku. You alright? What were those things he threw? Bombs. They were made of energy, so I absorbed them. He raised his palm and a small glob of the same green bomb emerged from his hand. It was fun to have new energies to play with, too bad he will probably never get a refill of that kind. Burnin nodded with a smile and then turned to the policeman. Now to teach you about this side of hero work. Burnin greeted the officer and began to tell him what had happened in detail. Izuku paid attention to the whole conversation as the officer took notes and then gave them a nod and went off to finish his work. Then what? Izuku watched the 3 unconscious men get loaded into a van with suppression cuffs on them each. We continue on our patrol, and once we get back to the agency we fill out the paperwork for this incident. Thankfully there was no collateral damage of any sort other than what they caused at the door. Burnin explained. Come on, let's keep going. Just as Izuku was going to follow, someone called out to him. Excuse me. Izuku turned to see the woman that was stuck with the bomb. I wanted to say thank you for what you did. What's your name? Flux. Your thanks are appreciated. Izuku nodded and she beamed a smile at him and he turned back to follow Burnin. When they got out of earshot, Burnin spoke up. She was pretty cute, huh? She elbowed him and gave him a teasing smirk. Izuku raised an eyebrow at her. I suppose, why? I mean, I'm just curious to see where your standards are. Or maybe you have someone else in mind. She dangled some bait casually. His mind flashed to Toru's beaming smile instead of that woman's. He smiled unconsciously and Burnin latched onto it. Oh ho, what's with that smile? Who popped into your mind? She smiled like a cat that caught a canary. His cheeks turned pink at his being caught. No one. She kept going with her teasing. None of that. Come on, tell me. She bumped shoulders with him in an attempt to break him. Let me guess, that pink girl. No, she is more of a wingman if I'd guess. The one with the earlobes. Shouldn't we be focusing on patrolling? He tried to change the subject. Or maybe that invisible girl. She was pretty close to you most of the festival once I watched it again. Izuku gave a minuscule twitch and her smile grew. It is her. Why are you so interested in this subject? He tried again to veer off the line of questioning. It makes sense to me. You can see energies, and with heat vision, you can see her. Oh, how romantic. She swooned. I wouldn't want to ruin what we have. Izuku finally broke and went along with her conversation. She is my first friend in 10 years and I don't want to lose that in an attempt to get more than I'm already grateful for. He didn't yell it, but his words showed enough emotion for the hero to understand. She calmed down from her antics and thought for a moment. And if she doesn't just want to be friends, then she can make that choice. I don't want to risk anything. Now when everything has been turning around for me. Burnin heard the vulnerability in his words and let it be. Instead, she patted his shoulder and pointed at a food stand. I'm hungry, let's get some food. She smiled. The rest of the patrol continues without any incident as they return to the agency. Endeavor and Shoto stood in the lobby talking to an office worker. She gave some papers to Endeavor, bowed, and left. He sifted through them and then turned to the two. You've returned, anything of note? He said to Burnin. An attempted BNE, Flux stopped a potential hostage situation and that was it. Burnin jabbed a thumb at Izuku to the side. Hostage situation, he raised an eyebrow at her. One used his quirk, some kind of bomb, to threaten me to let him go. Flux caught two, but the last was attached to a woman. He absorbed its energy and I was able to take down the man. She explained. Izuku raised a finger and showed the energy he had acquired. It pulsed green and then it was sucked back into his hand. Endeavor nodded with a grunt. Show him what paperwork needs to be filled out. After you're done, meet me in the gym to continue your training. The last he spoke to Izuku, and then he turned to the elevator. Shoto gave Izuku a nod and split off to who knows where. The next day, Izuku woke up sore from the training but didn't complain as he was learning much from the top hero. He had sparred with Shoto but he was outclassed on that front. He followed his normal routine in the morning and then went to the gym. After some training, Endeavor called the UA students to a room with Burnin and some of his sidekicks. Once everyone was in the room, Endeavor spoke. It's time to go to Hosu. Prepare to leave an hour. Hosu. Why, sir? One of the sidekicks asked. It's time for the hero killer to come to an end, he said with conviction. Izuku and Shoto sat side by side on a train to Hosu with part of Endeavor's agency in the same train car. It was nearing mid-afternoon as they finally reached the train station they would depart on. Izuku slipped on his gas mask that covered the lower part of his face and stretched as he got up to step off the bullet train. Everyone began to split off immediately after leaving the station as they already knew where their routes were. Izuku and Shoto stuck with Endeavor and Burnin. Izuku had read up on Stain a while ago. From what he understands, Stain began to kill or critically injure heroes in a select pattern. He would target 3 or 4 heroes per city and move on to the next city. He had seen the pattern immediately after looking up the victim of Stain. They were heroes who were accused or guilty of some sort of corruption. Whether it be a scandal or being lax in their duty of being a hero, Stain had targeted them for that reason. Ideally, how they should capture Stain is using a hero that fits his parameters and using them as bait, springing a trap. No one knows what his quirk is, but from what Izuku was able to glean, they all died to a bladed weapon with little resistance of the victim. What he didn't know was that Stain's last target was Ingenium, Ida's brother. Izuku never paid attention to anyone in his class, other than to assess if they would be a threat in any way, and Ida was the same. Now still was the same, but he paid attention to his friends. He was sure the boy was devastated about what had happened to his brother, but Izuku didn't notice how he was after the sports festival. The 4 continued their patrol of Hosu with minimal activity. Minor issues Endeavor took care of without much trouble while Izuku and Shoto stood back and watched. There were many fans taking pictures as Endeavor walked, but he paid them no mind. Burnin on the other hand posed for a few and tried to drag Izuku and Shoto with her, to little success. The longer the day passed, the more Endeavor seemed to get annoyed with the lack of news of Stain. Izuku was sure that they wouldn't cross paths with him for one main reason. You won't find Stain this way, Izuku stated as they walked. Everyone turned to Izuku and Endeavor furrowed his brows at the intern. Explain, he demanded. All of Stain's victims were alone and in alleyways. Not once has he struck when out in the open or when the hero was in a group. Izuku shrugged as if it was obvious. Endeavor thought about what Izuku said and grunted in agreement. Then how would you try and find him, boy? Bait. Burnin spoke before Endeavor did. That's dark, don't you think? Izuku shrugged. Stain always targets heroes with set criteria. They all have been involved with something the hero didn't want to be revealed. Scandals, skimming money from employees, being too aggressive, being too passive, or the like. Shoto and Burnin looked at him weirdly. Endeavor continued to stare at the boy. How do you know this? I research for any information on anything that seems valuable to me, and I've done a lot of research. He stared back into Endeavor's eyes. He had nothing to say in return and turned back to continue their route. The day dragged on and they stopped for a late lunch. It was beginning to get dark when Endeavor called his sidekicks that took other routes to call it a day and head back to the agency. They were a few blocks away from the train station when there was an explosion behind them. They immediately ran back to the scene and it was chaos. Buildings were on fire and some heroes fought familiar monsters, Nomu. Those are Nomu, the same kind from the USJ. They look different. The one at the USJ had multiple quirks. Regeneration, strength, speed, and kinetic negation. Flux spouted out for their benefit. The League of Villains is behind this then. Flux, stop those fires. Shoto, support him and evacuated civilians. You have full permission to use your quirks. Burnin, with me. Now, go. Endeavor ordered and blasted off to the fight. Flux and Shoto sprinted off to the nearest fire and to the hero that was trying to contain it. Flux ran past the hero and gently pulled all the flames from the building. He didn't want to turn the mostly still intact building into slag and glass. The hero on the scene watched as his job was done for him as the streams of fire were sucked into Flux's body. One of the walls began to collapse on the top floor and Shoto covered it in ice, stopping it in place. Civilians continued to run out of the now smoking building and the pair ran off to the next building without stopping to speak to the hero who watched them go. Flux and Shoto didn't speak as they focused on the next building. They took care of another building and helped a civilian get to safety before one of the Nomus attacked them. There was a shout of warning and Flux turned up to see a winged Nomu diving for them. Izuku didn't hesitate and pulled out a handful of ball bearings and shot them with a kinetic blast at the diving monster. The expulsion of kinetic energy caused the projectiles to break the sound barrier and then slammed into and through the Nomu. One wing was torn off completely and the rest impacted into its body and head. It spiraled with one wing gone and crashed hard against a car, denting the side heavily. It lay slumped and unmoving against the asphalt, dead before it hit the ground. Shoto stared at his classmate in surprise at his calculated execution of the monster. The heroes who shouted in warning ran up to the unmoving corpse and prepared to take it down, unknowing it was already dead. "You two get back," one of the heroes shouted at the two. "It's dead, no electrical signal in its body anymore," Flux said, running past them into the next burning building. Shoto followed after him, leaving the bewildered heroes behind. "Hey, stop right there," one of the heroes shouted at Izuku. He did so and turned to the approaching hero. "What is it?" he asked. "You just killed a villain. Who are you?" The hero prepared to apprehend the boy before him. "That wasn't a villain, it was a bioengineering monster. My name is Flux," Izuku said impatiently. "What are you talking about? You killed it without an attempt to take it down non-lethally." The hero continued to pester Izuku. "That wasn't the first Nomu we've fought. They don't stop and they don't surrender, they just do what they are ordered to do, monsters." Izuku explained and began to leave again to help contain the fires. "I'm with Endeavor if you want to file a complaint." He threw Endeavor under the bus because he could. They didn't stop him again to his relief. "You don't care that you just took a life?" Shoto asked as they ran. "That thing wasn't alive in the sense we are. What Shigaraki said was that they created them, if they were alive in there. Then, it would have been a mercy to kill it," Izuku said coldly. "And if they were a villain? Alive, like you and me. If it was necessary, but I have options for taking people down without bloodshed." The next building had screaming coming from one window. It opened and a mother and child coughed out and yelled for help. Izuku released kinetic blasts from his feet and speed up. He left Shoto behind in seconds. Flux left a crater as he jumped to the side of the window. His hand glowed with heat and he caught himself in the handhold. He melted into the outside wall. He absorbed the heat from the handhold and then he began to absorb the heat from the inside of the room with the mother and child. They felt immediate relief from the heat on their backs, but they felt terror when the ceiling cracked and began to creak ominously. The mother turned to the teenager, now that she got a closer look, and pleaded. "Take him." She held the boy in her arms with tears in her eyes. "No." Flux denied her request and instead grabbed both of them. He held them tight and pushed back, pulling the two out of the window. They screamed in terror and the mother held her child close. Flux positioned his back to the ground and absorbed the impact of both his own and the two in his arms. They landed softly, but they began to crush their savior under their weight. He pushed them to the side and checked them over. Then he heard the room they were in collapse and then the rest of the building came with it. A barrier of ice grew between them and the building, saving them from any debris that might have gotten flung their way. "Are you two injured?" Flux was able to ask them. "Thank you." The mother pulled Izuku into an embrace by the neck. She was shaken but didn't seem hurt. The mother and child weren't physically injured, but the two students escorted them to where civilians were being evacuated. Once some paramedics saw them coming, they ran over to take them off Flux's and Shoto's hands. They took a quick break and then moved to see where they could help since that was the last building on fire. They were far off from where they began, but they stopped when Flux heard something. He raised his hand to stop Shoto and held a finger to his mouth. He tilted his head and began to jog into an alleyway. Shoto followed and tapped his classmate on the arm. Flux caught the questioning eyes and whispered, "I hear someone." Izuku absorbed the sound around their feet and began to run to the clattering. He felt the 3 heat signatures and sped up. The two arrived just in time for Stain to stab his sword down at Ida's prone arm. He screamed in pain and Izuku held back Shoto from charging. He glared at him for doing so. Instead of rushing ahead, Flux aimed and charged a lightning bolt, not a small one. Stain reacted in time when he smelled the ozone and dodged the streaking lightning bolt aimed at his back. It did succeed in pushing Stain away from the 2 prone victims. "Shoto, get Tenya and the other one. I'll cover you," Flux said and Shoto nodded. Stand aside, my quarrel is with these two. Stain growled and aimed his sword at them. Izuku asked to buy some time for Shoto. You target corrupt heroes, why Tenya? Stain stared at Izuku and then answered. You were correct, but that one. He jabbed a sword at Tenya. Took it upon himself to attempt to be judge, jury, and executioner. You, on the other hand, know why I purge these unworthy heroes. Yes, every single hero was guilty of something. Except for Ingenium. Why him? He could sense Shoto begin to drag away Tenya behind Izuku. He got in my way, simple enough. He shrugged. And what do you think of my work? Why are you asking so many questions? Your victims are getting away. Izuku was confused at the way Stain was reacting. Because you are different, I can see it in your eyes. You see the corruption just like me. Answer my question. Your work, you're doing it wrong. He shook his head. Stain tilted his head. Wrong, how? Shoto finished bandaging Tenya's arm but still had to get the other hero. You were clipping the leaves of a weed. How do you get rid of the whole weed? By the root. Izuku was very aware of how he would have done what Stain is doing. Stain hummed for a moment. You are just like me. He smiled. Why not join me? Help me cull these so-called heroes, roots and all. Izuku's mind flashed with the idea but spoke instead. Not part of the plan. With that, he released a cone of flames down the alleyway. Stain emerged from the flames, injured. He swung his swords at Flux and he blocked with his arm. The impact was absorbed and the jacket saved him from getting a nasty cut. The hero killer was shocked by a spray of electricity that coursed through his swords. Flux pushed his advantage and slammed his fist against Stain's arm. There was a sickening crunch as the kinetic blast shattered his arm. The sword fell from limp fingers but that didn't stop Stain. His other sword swung up and Izuku stopped it with the palm of his hand. Then he melted the blade and warped the metal of the rest. Stain growled in frustration and backed away as he threw away his ruined weapon. But a blast of the coldest temperature he'd ever felt shocked his system and made him lose focus. His lungs burned with stinging pain with every breath, and the blood that dribbled out of his broken arm began to crystallize. He involuntarily started to shiver from the absolute cold that he was subjected to. He raised his throwing knife and threw it right at the boy's face. He didn't even block and it stopped dead in its tracks as it made contact. He needed to escape, but not before he took out his target. Flux was prepared for the last-ditch effort to attack him. Stain threw a flurry of weapons at him. But it wasn't in an attempt to kill him. Instead, it was to block his sight and get around him and get to the paralyzed hero. His heat sense didn't let him get away. He pulled from the bag of rubber balls this time and did the same as the Nomu in the sky. Stain leapt off the wall and dove for native. Flux shot the rubber balls and they whizzed through the air at a much lower speed than before. Most of them landed on him in various locations across his body. The impacts drove him off course of his target and landed roughly against the alley wall. Izuku sprinted with kinetic-enhanced steps to the rising figure. He kicked the arm trying to push himself up and Stain fell prone again. Stay down. Shoto, how are they? He had his hand aimed at the villain. Tenya yelled. No, Stain is mine for what he did to my brother. He raged on the ground. Stain, what did you do to them? Why can't they move? Shoto demanded the villain. Stain chuckled darkly. Wouldn't you like to know? He said mockingly. Flux began to observe the prone villain from arm's reach. It's your quirk, isn't it? He started without inflection. Stain's eyes snapped to the boy who beat him with raw power alone. That's why you use blades, you cut them. With the blood spilled, you can paralyze them. You would have been so much better than me at culling the unworthy. Stain marveled at the ability to determine his quirk with a moment's notice. Flux crouched down while his hand never strayed. I know. That's why I'm doing it from the inside out. His eyes were cold as ice and his tone held the conviction of absolute certainty. Stain began to chuckle and laugh in joy at hearing his words. Shoto, have you called for backup? Flux stood back up. The youngest Todoroki stared at his classmate and then at the villain laughing on the ground. He no longer had an image for Midoriya. Before, he thought of the green-haired boy as someone like him. He was hurt many times but hadn't given up. Their talk at the agency reinforced that, but in Hosu, not anymore. The way he planned out a way to bait Stain with a hero and then how he executed the Nomu with no remorse. Now, he took out the infamous hero killer, Stain alone, and left him laughing on the ground. He shook himself out of the thoughts and answered, "As soon as I grabbed Tenya, his wound is bad." Just as he finished, Endeavor arrived at the alleyway entrance and froze at the scene before him. Vernon arrived next to him and did the same. Endeavor approached Flux and motioned Vernon to check with his son. "What happened here, from the start?" he demanded. "Shoto and I heard a noise from an alleyway after escorting 2 civilians to paramedics. He investigated and we found Stain standing over those 2. He motioned to Native and Tenya. Shoto grabbed them and did his best to help them while I fought Stain. I won. He must not have been very powerful, pitiful." Endeavor growled as he placed cuffs on the villain. Flux didn't correct him and didn't care to. "I received a complaint from some low-level hero you killed a Nomu, is that correct?" "Yes, while Shoto and I moved to the next building we were attacked." "Will that be an issue?" He tilted his head. Endeavor stared at the boy and shook his head. "I'll deal with it." "Vernon, how are those 2? He turned to his second in command. "They need to see a hospital bed soon. A severe stab wound on the shoulder for Tenya and Native has a slash across his chest, shallow." Vernon stated. "Very well, let's go." He picked up Stain from the ground by the arm and cried in pain. He immediately let him go. "I shattered his arm." "Don't grab him by the arm," Flux said way too late. Endeavor shot him a glare but Izuku shrugged, he had forgotten. Vernon had already called an ambulance for the 2 injured and a police van for Stain. Iida glared at the back of Izuku's head for what he interrupted. Shoto tried again to figure out his classmate but failed to do so. And Vernon wonders how she could get in contact with that invisible girl for some encouragement. From what Endeavor said as they walked out of the alley and to the main road, the rest of the Nomu were dead or captured in one case. There were only 3 when the attack started, with Izuku killing one and Endeavor killing another. The last was taken out by multiple heroes working together until they contained it. The fires were put out in record time thanks to Izuku and Shoto working together. While Shoto mainly supported Izuku, Vernon praised the 2 vigorously. Iida hadn't said anything the whole while they walked and he was helped along. Native had woken up but was too weak from blood loss to move by himself. "I was reported that you killed a Nomu. What happened?" Endeavor said with a demand more than a question. "Shoto and I were running to the next burning building and it dove towards us. I killed it and it crashed into a car instead of us," he said without remorse. "You did not attempt to subdue it, why?" Endeavor questioned. "Nomu do not think, they only follow commands and that is it. They are no more than rabid animals to be put down." Vernon had to reevaluate what she thought of the boy she got to know the day before, and by the looks of it, Shoto already began to. She could see the similarities between Flux and Endeavor, but Flux was cold and calculating to Endeavor's raging fire. They arrived back on the road where police and ambulances drove back and forward. Endeavor hailed one and they pulled next to him. They handed over Native and Iida to the paramedics and they began to work on them. A police car rolled up to them and began to chain up Stain after they were done gawking at the infamous villain. Oddly enough, Stain never resisted and was shoved into the back of the police cruiser. He looked at Izuku one last time and gave him a tooth-filled smile that chilled anyone who was looking. Izuku didn't bat an eye and only watched the hero killer get taken away. He turned from the police cruiser when he heard Iida's name being called out. Manuel had found his intern finally and was looking him over. "What happened? Where did you go?" the hero almost demanded of the student, but he was more worried than angry. Iida didn't respond and only looked away with a scowl. He went hunting down the hero killer. His head snapped up and glared with his teeth almost bared at Izuku, who had spoken. Manuel turned around at Izuku's voice. "What? Is that true?" He turned back around to Iida, who continued to glare at Izuku. "It doesn't matter anyways, he will get a slap on the wrist and walk away with a blemished mark on his record. He was part of a family of heroes and he will get away with being a vigilante just like anyone with enough power could get away with anything. The number 2 hero was a shining example of it. "Let go, we are done here," Endeavor commanded and everyone followed. It took some time to get back to the agency since the train was taken out by one of the Nomu, but it was well past midnight when they arrived. Endeavor disappeared after telling them to clean up and get some rest. Izuku did exactly that with a hot shower and a quick meal. He lay down on his bed and checked his phone for the first time since that morning. He had dozens of calls and over 30 messages from his friends. He winced at the thought of worrying them. He sent a message to his group chat that he was alright, and he immediately got a call from Toru. Since he was alone in the room, he picked up. "Izuku, are you alright? I saw the news and they said that Endeavor's agency was all over Hosu with Nomu everywhere, and now they are saying Stain was captured." He could hear the tears in the tone of her voice, and that made his throat close up slightly. "I'm okay. I'm not hurt, Toru. Yay, we were in Hosu and I helped with the fires and with civilian evacuation. I wasn't hurt. The worst I got was the wind knocked out of me when I cushioned the fall for a mother and child. I'm sorry for worrying you." He took a breath and he could hear her do the same. "Also, I fought the hero killer," he admitted without thinking, and immediately regretted it. It was quiet on the other side of the call as Toru processed the statement. "What? It wasn't on purpose. Shoto and I were headed back and I heard some noise and we went to see if anyone needed help. Iida and a hero called Native were about to be killed by him and I beat him while Shoto helped the two," he hurriedly explained. Toru let out a chuckle and began to laugh uproarious. "You beat the hero killer when no one could. Wait until the others hear about this." She kept laughing. Izuku began to worry about his closest friend. "Toru, are you okay?" She calmed down and said, "I'm okay, Izuku. I think it's a combination of being tired and the worry that you might have been hurt." "You've been up the whole time." "Of course, I have been. You really worried me. I don't want to imagine you getting hurt and not knowing." She ended softly. "I'm alright, please get some sleep. It's late, we can talk some more when you are rested." "Okay. Good night, Izuku." "Good night, Toru." She hung up the phone and rolled around in her borrowed bed at the agency. She felt relieved that Izuku was alright and the way the call ended. She quietly squealed in joy at how he said goodnight to her. She bolted into a sitting position when she heard a chuckle from the doorway. The hero she was interning at was leaning against the doorframe and softly laughing. "How long have you been there?" Toru almost screamed in embarrassment and surprise. "When I heard yelling I ran over to make sure everything was alright, but the way you were rolling around the bed like a lovesick schoolgirl, I think you are alright," she said, laughing again as her intern pulled the blanket over her head to hide. "Was that the Izuku you were talking about?" Toru groaned in embarrassment. "Yes, he said he wasn't hurt." "That's good to hear. Get some sleep. We'll continue your training in the morning." "All right. Good night, Spectre." The hero gave a wave and closed the door behind her. The rest of the internship passed without much excitement after Hosu for Izuku. The only time when something notable happened was the next day when police came into the agency for Izuku and Shoto for using their quirks in public without a license. Endeavor shot them down harshly when he intervened. When they tried to push forward but with the intent of getting Izuku only because of the Nomu he killed, Endeavor ordered them to leave. From then, the police never gave Izuku any trouble because of what he did. Izuku continued his hand-to-hand training with Endeavor and some other heroes that volunteered to join. He gained much experience on that front. They went on patrol a few times more, but only small-time criminals ever showed up while Izuku was with Burnin. The news covered what had happened in Hosu. They covered the Nomu attack to Stain being captured by an unidentified hero. That part surprised Izuku. He had expected Endeavor to take the credit, but when he asked the hero he only got a noncommittal response. The week came to an end and it was time for Izuku to depart. He left without saying much to anyone. Burnin was the only one that gave him a farewell, but it was short. He boarded the train and headed back to the apartment. He chatted with his friends meanwhile he rode the train. Everyone had a good time with their heroes and learned much. Not all got as much experience in the field, but they didn't complain much. When Izuku walked into the apartment, he felt something wrong. Something in the apartment felt different and he looked around cautiously. He found a note on the countertop of the kitchen. He picked it up and read it. He felt empty as he reread the few words on the paper. "Goodbye, Inko Midoriya." He left the paper on the counter and walked down the hall to his mother's room. He opened it and it was empty, nothing remained in her room. He stared blankly at the empty room with clenched teeth. Everything else in the apartment was still there, but anything of Inko was gone. She had left him while he was gone for the week. He walked to the living room and sat down. Thoughts raced through his head as he thought about what this could mean for him. Inko had left him. He couldn't think of her as mother anymore, and all that she left was one word. Inko's neglect had grown as the years passed, and this was the cherry on top. He had grown to resent her as the years passed, with her never being a mother to him. After a while, he could no longer love her as a mother, but at least she left money for food and had a roof over his head. But now, how long will he last? He had to find out how long he had left to live in the apartment until he would be kicked out for not paying rent. The landlord of the building lived on the first floor of the building, and Izuku left to ask him. His funds from the merch he had sold could keep him afloat, but he wasn't sure for how long. He knocked on the door and waited. The landlord opened the door in a t-shirt and shorts. "Midoriya, right, what can I do for you?" "I want to know when my rent is due next," Izuku asked. He looked confused at him for a moment and answered, "Your mama came sometime this week and paid for the next 3 years, utilities included." "She didn't tell you?" Izuku felt a weight fall off his shoulders and shook his head. "She didn't. Sorry to bother you." He bowed slightly and left. Back in the apartment, Izuku sat back on the sofa and rubbed his face. He was angry at Inko for leaving him like this, and he was sad that she would leave with just a note with no explanation. Yes, he had lost the love between a child and the mother, but this felt final to him. With nothing else he could do, he went to make something to eat. That reminded him of his bank account set up by Inko. He checked it and the weekly deposit was there like before. Hopefully, that would continue. For now, he would eat and then plan for the worst to happen. But truthfully, Inko being gone didn't change his plans of being a hero. His routine didn't change after Inko had truly abandoned him. He got up, did his exercises, talked to his friends for a bit, and then go to sleep. The weekend ended and Izuku was now headed back to UA for his classes to continue. He walked through the halls of UA until he reached his homeroom. He opened it and was immediately given a hug from a floating uniform. "Missed you," Toru murmured, and then grabbed Izuku by the hand and to the rest of their friends, who all welcomed him with their greetings. Izuku felt warmth fill his chest at the smiling faces of his friends. "It's good to see you all again." He smiled back at them. "You have a lot of explaining to do. You made all of us worry." Mina mock lectured and jabbed a playful finger at him. "Seriously, I just finished training and I see the news that Hosu is on fire." Kaminari agreed. "Sorry, it wasn't my intention to worry you all." He tried to placate them. "Leave the boss alone, he can take care of himself." Shiro chimed and patted Izuku in support. "What happened?" "Most of what the news says is that Stain was arrested and that Nomu attacked." Jiro asked. Izuku was about to respond when Iida walked through the door and locked eyes with him. Iida's face contorted slightly as he went to sit down. Izuku scoffed with not an ounce of surprise that he was still in UA. The others caught the whole thing and gave each other surprised looks. Aizawa followed soon after and everyone scrambled to their seats. "I'll tell you guys later." Izuku squeezed Toru's hand once more before taking his seat. Aizawa stood at the podium and scanned the room. His eyes lingered on Izuku and he stared back. He moved on and then spoke. "Your midterms are coming up, prepare yourselves." With that, he left the room and classes started as usual. The day's lessons dragged on until lunch came around and his friend grouped up to head to the cafeteria. They got their trays of food and sat together like always. They all stared expectantly at Izuku. "Well, come on." Mina was the first to burst out. Izuku chuckled and began to tell them about Hosu. He left nothing out as he told them about the Nomu, him putting out fires with Todoroki, him saving the family of 2, and then Stain. "Todoroki and I found Stain over Iida ready to kill him. I pushed Stain back and Todoroki grabbed Iida and a hero Stain was going to kill. The reason Iida was there was because he went after Stain in revenge for ending Ingenium's career. He went vigilante." Kaminari almost stood out of his seat. Jiro jabbed him with her quirk for being so loud. Apparently, he split off from the hero he was interning at to hunt him down. "But we found him face down ready to be butchered with native. That's why he was glaring at me when he walked in." I interrupted him from taking his righteous revenge. They were quiet for a moment to digest what he had told them. Toru spoke first. I understand wanting to take revenge for what Stain did to his brother, but he would have died if it wasn't for you. The others nodded their agreement. Wait. Mina waved her hands to hit an imagery pause button. Was he found out about going vigilante and wanting to kill Stain? I sure as shit didn't cover for him when the hero he was interning under found him. Kaminari furrowed his brow. Then shouldn't he be expelled for doing so? Yay, police would have found out, and then Ua should have kicked him out. Zero agreed. That's the keyword, should. But, since he is from a strong hero family, rules can be bent for the powerful. He scowled at his food and jabbed at it frustratingly with his utensils. Toru placed a hand over his arm to calm him down. That's pretty unfair, Jiro said and glanced over at Iida, who was eating quietly while Uraraka tried to talk to him. Izuku shrugged. But forget about that. What about you guys? What did you all do for your internships? He smiled up at his friends. They took the change of subject and they told everyone else what they did. Kaminari got better at his lightning and practiced more with his enhanced movements with internal electricity. Zero also honed the skills that Izuku recommended to him. He even got to use them on patrol once against a thug trying to run away. He was pretty proud of that. Mina was able to cover herself in viscous acid to make a layer of protection like Izuku's theory. Acid mist was still a work in progress. Jiro helped with a hostage situation and learned some hand-to-hand. Toru was last to tell them about her time. So, Spectre helped me with some more sneaking techniques and the light beam Izuku taught me. Also, something I've been working on, but it's not ready for me to show you guys. Oh, what is this super secret project you've been working on? Mina leaned close to her friend. Come on, show us something. She wiggled her eyebrows suggestively. Toru pushed her away. No, not until I can get it right. Can I help in any way? Izuku offered with a smile. Toru blushed and looked away. Nope. Well, you can, but I want it to be a surprise for everyone. Mostly for Izuku, but she didn't say that out loud. Lunch ended and everyone headed to their next class, Heroics. They were told to meet in the industrial section for class. All Might arrived and looked over them and began. Welcome back. I hope this past week has given you a good look at the real deal. For today, let's see what you have learned. Let's do a race to save the civilian, me. A screen appeared with the first group to race. All Might leapt away and landed in the distance. Izuku was first with Zero, Mina, Ojiro, and Iida. Mina, Zero, and Izuku gave each other fist bumps and got ready. Izuku got ready and ignored Iida's glare to the side of his head. There was a loud boom and they raced off. Izuku propelled himself with kinetic blasts, keeping up with Iida on speed. The speedster kept glancing at Izuku as they sped along in All Might's general direction. He could hear Zero's tape behind him as he tried to keep up with the two. Izuku saw the hit coming from his side and absorbed the kinetic impact from Iida's backhand. Izuku held tight and returned the favor by absorbing energy from Iida and the surrounding area. The engines on his legs stalled as the area turned pitch black and the sound stopped existing. Iida was distorted to the highest degree and crashed hard to the ground. Izuku didn't look back as he heard the class president crash and skid on the concrete. Zero let out a bark of a laugh and tried to get ahead of Izuku, but he poured more kinetic energy out and then launched upwards to where All Might was standing with a frown. Damn, I was really close, Zero said, landing beside Izuku. Midoriya, what happened? All Might stared at Izuku. Ojiro and then Mina arrived just as Izuku turned to All Might. He tried to trip me up and I defend myself, why? Izuku tilted his head. Yay, he tried to backhand him. Zero saw it all from his vantage point above them. Iida arrived last with one of his glass lenses broken and his armor banged up. He threw Izuku a venomous glare. All Might pursed his lips in consternation. Izuku watched the number one hero shake his head and yell out for the next group to line up. Izuku scoffed audibly at him and walked away. Izuku sat on an empty ledge and his two friends sat with him. Mina groaned, "It's so hot." She felt immediate relief as it cooled. Thanks. She bumped shoulders with Izuku and smiled. Any time. He smiled back. You guys can call me Izuku if you like. Oh, you don't think Toru will get jealous, do you? I thought it was a special privilege for her only, something special between you two. She leaned in closer to Izuku's continuous redding face. Leave Izuku alone. Shiro batted her Mina away from his friend. You use Honta if you like, I don't mind either. He smiled at Izuku. Kaminari arrived and sat down with a huff and breathing a bit hard. If that's the case, then I guess you can use my given name too. Izuku felt warmth fill his chest as he sat with his friends. He had forgotten about the note left for him in the kitchen and only focused on who was around him. He could also understand Ida's want for revenge. If anything happened to his gang of friends, he didn't know what he would do. But he shoved those thoughts away as Toru shoved Mina to the side to sit next to Izuku and gave him a beaming smile only meant for him to see. After the race was over, everyone changed and packed up their stuff to go home. Iida was one of the first to be out of the door. Uraraka tried to call out for him but he ignored her. She turned on Izuku for answers. What happened at Hosu? Ever since that day, he's been like that. She asked with both frustration and worry. Izuku calmly answered, if he doesn't want to talk then that's his business. It's not hard to connect the dots. Why do you think he was interned in Hose with a hero with a water quirk? The same city where a specific villain was arrested is somewhat connected to the Iidas. That's the information everyone has, you can guess the rest from there. He turned from her confused and conflicted stare to his friends. You guys want to head out and plan to study for the midterm? Honta proposed when he saw their leader was done being brooding and mysterious. Yes, I need so much help for that. Denki almost cried. You need help with a lot of things. Kyoka jabbed with a teasing smirk. Not to worry, Izuku will drag us across the finish line even if he is dragging out cold dead bodies. Mina said with conviction. Everyone turned to her and she blushed slightly. I'm not dragging anyone anywhere. He chuckled and made to exit the classroom with his friends and Toru holding his arm. Midoriya, would you be open to helping me tutor some others at my home? Yaoyorozu asked the odd boy. No, I'm going to be helping them to study. He nodded to his gang of friends and turned to leave. Toru pinched him and whispered. Be nice. Izuku rubbed where she pinched him with his friends giggling behind him at the scene. He turned back to Yaoyorozu. I'd rather help my friend, apologies. He heard Toru grumble that was just as bad as before. Once he and his clique of friends had left, Yaoyorozu let out a sigh. I'm not surprised he shot my idea down. What do you think he meant about Iida? Uraraka asked the heiress. Yaoyorozu had an idea of what he was implying but to say it out loud and be wrong, she shook her head. I'm not entirely sure. He's really weird, one minute he's like that, and the next he is all buddy-buddy with his group of friends, Sato said. He must have a reason, after all, he was first in both entrance exams. Kirishima said and turned to Bakugo. You've known him before UA, was he like this before too? 1,000 memories flashed before Bakugo's eyes. How should I know? He grumbled softly and left. That's another weird thing, he knows something. Ojiro joined in. Todoroki was about to exit the classroom to avoid being questioned but it was too late. Todoroki, did Midoriya ever give out any clues why he is the way he is? Uraraka asked. He stopped and gave out a sigh. He did, and if you want to know, ask him yourself. He left quickly before any more questions were shot at him. The gang of friends made it to the train station. They chatted about planning for the midterm. In their group, they made up of the bottom four with Denki being 20th, Mina 19th, Honta 17th, and Toru 16th. Kyoka was set at 7th. While it may be hard to tutor Izuku's friends alone, he was confident about pulling them up a few ranks. All Izuku needed was what they were lowest in and build from there. Granted, he wasn't expecting them to jump up to the top of his class but he will make sure that they have passable grades. So, where are we going to study? Mina asked. Everyone paused and thought about it. We do have the clearing, Kyoka said. Anyone's home big enough? Everyone paused and thought about it. Izuku didn't want them to come to the apartment even if it was empty, Denki spoke. My basement does have enough space but I'm worried about getting distracted. Your family loud? Honta asked. Just my sister, she likes to bug me sometimes. I think I'll be fine, plus I want to make profiles for each of you so I can help you study where you need the most, Izuku said. Mina grabbed him and hugged him with mock tears in her eyes. Oh thank you. I knew I could count on you. To Denki's house? Toru asked. To Denki's. Mina let go of Izuku and turned back to the trains waiting for them to board. Which one? One train closed its doors and left. That one. He pointed at the one leaving. After arriving at the Kaminari residence, they all filed into the modest home. It was neat but not spotless. It was a well-lived home. Izuku had another pang of jealousy but pushed it down as Denki's mother peeked around the corner of the kitchen and greeted them all. Hi there. Are you all Denki's friends? It's so nice to meet you all. She gave them a beaming smile. Her hair was in a bun with a few strands dangling around her face. Her hair was a brilliant blonde with small arcs of electricity moving around it. You all can call me Tagawa. I cleared out the basement, you guys head on down there. They greeted her and made their way downstairs following Denki. The basement was more of a downstairs living room with a TV on the wall, a coffee table in the middle, and 2 sofas around it. Denki pointed out the bathroom for them and then they got started on doing their homework. When they got that done, they moved on to studying for the midterms. Izuku looked at everyone's grades from all their subjects and began to work on a file for each one of them. Kyoka was the only one that didn't need as much help as the others, but Izuku wasn't worried. Izuku sensed someone trying to creep up on them but paid little mind to it since whoever it was small. Even Kyoka noticed but only gave a small smile and waited. A small girl peeked her head over the sofa behind Denki. She met eyes with Izuku and he raises an eyebrow at her. Her eyes flickered to Denki and back to his. He gave a minuscule shrug. With that, she stretched a hand out to him and a small bit of blue electricity zapped his neck. He yelped in pain and instinctively batted behind him to hit his sister. Izuku chuckled and Denki pointed at him. Traitor. Izuku kept working on the profile before him without looking up. These your friends? The little girl around 10 asked. Get out of here, we're studying for midterms. The older brother pointed to the stairs. She walked past him and ignored him. She walked right up to Izuku who was sitting and didn't look up. She waited until he did and then she asked. Why did you drag your last match against Bakugo? I watched the whole festival on TV and you only did that with Bakugo, why? Tani. Denki said reproachfully. The rest looked worriedly at Izuku for his response. For his part, Izuku set down his pen and turned to Tani. At your school, do kids with weak quirks get picked on? Bullied? He asked calmly. She thought about it for a moment and then shook her head. Not really, only the mean kids. But they get in trouble when they're caught. Izuku nodded. Bakugo was my bully for 10 years, I just wanted some revenge. She looked confused. But you don't have a weak quirk? That's right, I have a very strong quirk. Tell me who gets bullied worse than people with weak quirks. Izuku hand raised and flashed through many types of energy. I don't know. She watched his hand, mesmerized. Quirkless are. Go look up Aldera Middle School, maybe you'll understand. Izuku closed his hand and shrugged while picking up his pen again. She watched Izuku for a minute longer and then tried to zap him. He absorbed it without looking. She tried again with more power and the same result. She turned to her brother. I like your friend. And she skipped off upstairs. Your sister just tried to zap me with enough electricity to make me have a heart attack, Izuku said once she left. What? The non-electric friends yelled. Denki sighed. Sorry about that. She has a habit of doing that to people she has met with an electric quirk to test them or something. I'm also sorry about her bringing up Bakugo. He winced more at that than her trying to kill Izuku. Is she always like that? Kyoka asked. Blunt, yay always. I'm fine. I think I'm going to tell people I was quirkless without trying to hide it anymore, Izuku said to everyone. Before, I didn't want anyone to find out because I didn't want Ua to be another Aldera and turn to Plan B now. It's easier to see what kind of person they are by them learning that information. Izuku felt a hug and turned to see Toru's head. Whatever you choose, I'll be by your side. She squeezed him and he returned the hug. Izuku looked up and saw that the rest nodded their heads in agreement with what Toru said. He subtly wiped his eyes and smiled at them and held Toru close to him. Thanks, guys. After Izuku calmed down, Mina asked. What's Plan B? At the time, I'm sure you have Plan Bs for different situations now. The rest turned in curiosity at her question. Drop out of Ua and turn vigilante while probably following Stain's footsteps by getting rid of corrupt heroes in schools, he said casually. Everyone was quiet as they tried to digest what he had said. Well, Good thing Toru got to you first. Shiro gave out a bark of laughter. The rest joined in as Izuku's ears burned at the truth of the statement. They trained some and studied even more until midterm came. Each one of Izuku's friends took the profile he gave them and followed it to the letter. They noticed an improvement in their mock tests and were determined to pass with good grades. Once they finish, Denki and Mina were burnt out from the effort. I can't anymore, I'm done. Mina had her head on her desk as she complained. Maybe the practical will be easier, Denki prayed. The class emptied and headed to get change. Izuku was looking forward to seeing what they gave them as a midterm. He had heard rumors about it being robots like the entrance exam, but he had told his friends not to count on it. Everyone was changed and lined up in front of Aizawa. Then the rest of the faculty followed with Nezu popping out of Aizawa's scarf. The class groaned when they found out about fighting the staff. Izuku got a few mock glares from his friends when he was proven right about the practical. One by one they were paired off against a teacher. When his friends were paired off, he pulled out his notebook from his jacket. He was prepared to help them as much as he could, even by showing the hero's vital weaknesses. When he and Bakugo were paired last, he knew it wasn't going to be good. As soon as All Might landed, Izuku ignored the hero and turned to his friends to give them the information. All Might was still talking as Izuku got close to Toru first. He gave her the notebook with Snipe's profile. She immediately got it and began to read the whole page. One by one, he gave what information he had to them and then split off to the viewing room. Toru and Shoji were first against Snipe. Toru shared what Izuku had given her and they made a plan. The test started and Toru sprinted off, discarding her boots and gloves. Shoji began to listen and quickly found Snipe when he shot at him, and then smoke canisters arrived at his feet. Shoji began to throw whatever he could at the hero as Toru looped around. When she got close, Snipe pointed his gun in her general direction. "Don't think I've forgotten about you, Missy," he said in his southern accent. "But, I'm the distraction," she said innocently. Before he could turn, she emitted the brightest flash of light she could. Snipe cursed just as Shoji bodily tackled Snipe and grabbed his limbs. She casually walked up to the struggling hero and cuffed him. "Hagakure and Shoji pass," the automatic voice said. "Well done. How'd you two come up with that plan?" Snipe was set down and turned to Shoji. He pointed at Toru's area. "An information broker," she said giggling. Snipe paused at that. "But you didn't know who you were fighting until half an hour ago." "Yep." They heard her skip off to retrieve her boots and gloves with the plan to give Izuku a big hug for thanks and maybe a peck on the cheek. She flushed with no one to see and shook her head at the thought. How lewd, she laughed to herself. Mina and Denki were waiting for the test to start and they were nervous about who they were matched up against. The two dumbest first years against the smartest hero. What they quickly read about Nezu from Izuku's notebook was that he was arrogant when he thinks he has one, so they will play that to their advantage. The buzzer went off and they began to run, faking to way to the exit. When paths began becoming blocked, they acted panicked and made their way closer to the crane, one street at a time. When they were close enough, they sprinted to the base of it and saw a few robots from the entrance exam. One lightning bolt and an acid splash showed them immune to both. "This is bullshit," Mina yelled and splashed acid onto a pole Denki could use as a weapon. "Throw me at the crane." Denki didn't hesitate and with enhanced strength, threw his friend at the base. She caught herself roughly and began to melt the supports. She heard the crane groan and threw one more splash of acid on another support. "Run." She took her advice and ran in the opposite direction of the tipping crane. Denki threw away the scrap metal of the pole and jumped off the robot he was on top of. The crane with Nezu inside it collapsed, demolishing the buildings in its path. Once it settled, the two students raced to the cockpit to find it still encased in metal and glass. Nezu was still in the seated position, still drinking tea. "Well done, but you won't be able to break this cockpit open in time or get to the exit without failing. Good luck next time." He sounded so smug to Mina that she almost lost it. Mina looked around at the cockpit and found what she was looking for: a vent, nothing fancy. It's treated metal to resist acid. Nezu saw what she was looking for. "Oh ho ho," she laughed evilly. "That's fine. You know, Izuku has been teaching us really neat stuff. For example, Denki's enhanced body. For me, a body armor of acid. Her hand excreted the acid and it was covered in viscous acid clinging to her. She whipped it off. But another really difficult thing was making my acid go the opposite direction and make it mist. But I succeeded. Nezu's smug smile fell as he watched Denki sprint away and cover his mouth. His eyes snapped back to Mina. Now, do you want to call my bluff? Or should I do what Izuku warned me about and see how effective this mist is to a living being? A white mist appeared around the pink hand and she gently brought it up to her face and blew it inside the vent. I yelled. Nezu scurried up the exit and away from the white mist that did nothing. He turned to the giggling girl in question. Oh, that's just the diluted version. She gave him a smile that didn't reach her black and gold eyes. Honta's test was the easiest compared to the others except for Izuku. All he needed to do is use his newest attack pattern and she was wrapped up in tape. They left her struggling as they walked through the gates to pass. Midnight tried to goad Honta to cop a feel since she was down, but he had read her method of entrapment from Izuku. Kyoka's and Kota's match was horrifying for Present Mike. It was a boon for the two because of what Kyoka read about Present Mike's phobia in Izuku's notebook. She plugged in her speakers and with lots of trial and error was able to find the right frequency to block the hero's attack with her own. Next was Kota's part, when he built enough courage to command the bugs in the ground. Once he succeeded, all they heard were screams of panic from the hero. When they passed him, he was violently shivering. The gang of friends cheered as Kyoka passed through the gates. Not one of their number truly struggled against the exam. With Izuku's detailed information, they were able to find their opponents' weaknesses and how they fought to counter them. Kyoka walked into the room and she was greeted with congratulations. Kota walked up to Izuku and gave him a bow. Jiro told me you gave her the information we used to pass, thank you. He said quietly. Izuku gave him a nod and he walked off. You excited for your match? Toru finally asked. Izuku was set to go last so everyone could watch. Bakugo was on the other side of the room watching the match between Todoroki and Yaoyorozu against Aizawa. I'll be fine. He gave a reassuring smile to them. I believe him. After all, he's been the one to hand us the information to pass. He probably has plans to take everyone in this building out. Denki said and pointed it at Izuku. Izuku looked away guilty. It's only one good plan. He mumbled. Oh, Mina poked at him to tell them. You know I can release all my stored energy at once. Just do that and glass everything. I wouldn't do that though. He saw the looks he got from his friends. See, I told you he'll be fine. Denki waved away everyone's concerns. Izuku boarded the bus with Bakugo and rode in silence to their arena. He didn't have to read his notes on All Might, he already knew them front to back. His plan was simple, beat All Might into surrender with raw power. He wanted to make him say, I surrender, just for pride's sake. He could see All Might glance at the two through the rearview mirror, but Izuku paid no mind to him or Bakugo, who turned to him a few times. They arrived at a mock city and they got off. All Might paused to say some words of encouragement, but Izuku ignored him and walked past the number one hero to see where he will be fighting. Right then, good luck. Izuku felt the breeze of All Might leaping away and saw him land straight across from them. Izuku began to stretch and moved around freely without his jacket. He had given it to Toru to the wolf whistles of his friends and them pretending not to watch. Toru blushed heavily at their actions but beamed up at Izuku and wished him good luck. Her good luck was 1,000 times luckier than All Might's. He smiled to himself at the thought. He sensed Bakugo tried to approach Izuku but stopped at a distance. What is your plan? Bakugo finally asked. Izuku didn't turn around. To make him surrender. Start. The automatic voice said, and Izuku launched himself upwards in time to see the whole main street be blown away by the number one hero. He was so high up that he could see all of the mock city without turning his eyes. He began to blast himself at the speck that is Izuku's target. For the moment, he enjoyed the free fall and the peace of weightlessness. Then he blasted forward at All Might. First, he took out all of his ball bearings and shot them at the hero. They broke the sound barrier and plumes of dust rocketed up from where they missed or sparks where they hit their intended target. With his face covered, he didn't see Izuku launch the lightning bolt at the weak spot on All Might's side. He coughed up blood and staggered to the side while holding where his old injury was. He looked up at the boy who landed and his eyes were cold and calculating. That's all he got out as he saw Izuku rocket towards him faster than he could imagine. All Might moved dodged the strike to his abdomen and struck back at the boy. His fist collided with the boy's shoulder and stopped dead. Izuku backhanded his still outstretched arm and a massive kinetic force made him spin away. He stopped himself and stared at the boy. Fine then, time to show you what it means to be the... He was cut off again by a lightning bolt to his weak spot. He glared at the boy and launched forward. Instead of punching, he grappled the boy who tried to get away. He was too slow and All Might caught him and brought him into a bear hug. The gang of friends watched and winced just as Izuku was held by All Might. Their classmates looked at them. What? Ojiro asked them. Mina pointed at the screen. Izuku can release energy from anywhere on his body. Izuku absorbed all the sound in the immediate area and then blasted directly into the hero's face. All Might reeled back in pain and held his ears. Blood seeped out of his hands but he didn't have time to brace as Izuku struck to the side of All Might and launched him through a building and a building after that. He wasn't sure when he stopped but Izuku didn't care. He aimed his palm at where the line of destruction lay and concentrated a bead of fire like in the USJ. He infused it with the nuclear energy he barely used in release. The rubble in the immediate area melted in the proximity of the open flames, glass melted, and anything caught in the flames was incinerated. The air screamed as the white liquid flames rushed down the passage Izuku made with All Might's body. A stream of white flames shot through the crater and hit All Might just as he was getting up. He saw it coming and blocked it, thinking it was flames like another but it seared and burned his flesh. He yelled in pain and whipped his hands down to make an air pocket and leapt away. Izuku saw All Might run and stopped his stream of fire and instead reversed the flow and yanked the remaining thermal energy. Ice cracked around him and the burning and melted building cooled immediately causing them to crack under the temperature fluctuations. He turned and left a path of ash and slag to see All Might land with his arms and some of his chest burned black. His suit was burned away and covered his chest barely. Yield. Izuku commanded. You yield. He asked confused and huffing breath. You will. Izuku launched forward again and absorbed all the light in the area to blind All Might. With his sixth sense, Izuku was fine. All Might protected his wound and was open to getting struck in the knee. Izuku poured one of All Might's strikes and an appropriate amount from a Nomu at the USJ. The following kinetic blast was world-ending. Izuku heard the knee shatter and then All Might fall. He reversed the light and blinded the hero and absorbed the backhand that threw at Izuku in instinct. He heard the hero cry in pain from both his leg and being blinded. All Might didn't give up and clapped his hands causing a shockwave to emit around him. Izuku absorbed the sound and kinetic blast as everything around him was destroyed. Buildings collapsed and the road was torn up. As he tried to get up, Izuku blasted his weak spot with lightning again and All Might convulsed and collapsed while coughing up blood onto the ground. Yield. Izuku commanded again. Why do? He stopped at the hand that slapped onto his neck. You know, Yagi. The hero's eyes widen at his real name being used. Yes, I'm very good at finding information. I could have ended this exam as soon as you grabbed me but I didn't. I wanted to see you bloody and battered. Now, I ask you again. Do you yield or do I have to absorb the kinetic energy from your heart and blood until you pass out or glass the area around us with the nuclear fire that made your arms crispy or take all your thermal energy? Which will it be? Izuku absorbed some of the kinetic energy in his body to prove the point and he saw All Might get dizzy. He coughed up more blood and wheezed. I yield. The buzzer went off and called for Izuku and Bakugo, saying that they passed. Now tell me, All Might. He said the name with venom in his tone. Can I be a hero? I'm sorry, he said softly as steam rose off his body. Too little too late. Izuku spat and turned to walk away. He met eyes with Bakugo who was bloodied and stared at Izuku with horror. Why? He asked simply. Ask him, you two have a lot in common. He walked past Bakugo and looked at the destruction he left behind. Hey, you're lucky that the police raid happened. This is what Aldera would have been if they didn't come, people inside or not. He waved at the ash, slag, and glass. Bakugo stayed still and stared at the ground. You blame me, for all of it, he asked. Not all of it, but 10 years of it. He hissed out in hatred of the boy before him. But what does it matter? If you're powerful enough, you can do whatever you want, right? That's what I plan for anyway. With that, he began to walk to the main building, ignoring the scornful look Recovery Girl gave him with the gurney. Izuku felt a sigh of relief escaped him as he walked. He knows it isn't right to get your revenge, but Izuku didn't care for what people said, it was very satisfying. He looked at his energy stores and felt that they were low. Kinetic was pretty low, thermal was similarly low, electric was the same, and nuclear had a drop left. With a sigh, he began to absorb all the thermal energy in the area. Ice and frost cracked as he took every step to the main building. With every step, his reach stretched and his thermal core was filling nicely. When he arrived back at the main building, he had more thermal energy than he used. Behind him was a fringed landscape with a trail of footsteps. He turned back around and opened the door and made his way to the observation room. There were murmured voices, but they cut off when he walked in. He looked at his friends to see how they would react, but they gave him nods and smiles. His heart warmed more than absorbing the thermal energy could. I think we deserve a celebratory dinner of McDonald's, Mina pronounced to the group. Kyoka narrowed her eyes at Mina. Why are you saying it like that? McDonald's. What's wrong with McDonald's? She asked, trying to start an argument. Toru turned to Izuku and held his jacket closer to herself. How are you going to get your jacket back if you have nothing to trade for? She asked innocently. Izuku pulled his gas mask off and smiled at the invisible girl. What else can I trade you for it? He went along with her. Denki and Honta poked the two bickering girls to draw their attention to the two lovebirds. He has feeling for her, that's for sure, Honta said. Of course he does, but how to get them together? Mina stroked her non-existent beard. Toru blushed at his attention and pretended to think about it. How about a favor? One time only, no questions asked. She held the jacket out in temptation. If you ask me to do something illegal, it better be worth it. He took the jacket in agreement with a smile. Toru scoffed. What do you take me for? Of course, it will be worth it. She turned to see her group of friends act like they weren't watching the whole time. Denki pretended to pick at his fingernails, Mina twirled her hair, Kyoka played with her earlobes, and Honta cleaned his tape dispensers. Aizawa came in and met eyes with Izuku. He stared back without backing down. You're all dismissed. With that, he left. Someone mentioned McDonald's. Toru asked her group. You're all terrible people. Kyoka mock glared at everyone who looked innocently back. They changed and found a nearby fast food restaurant and promptly walked into it with gusto. It was beginning to get busy as school let out for everyone. The gang ordered their meals and sat down together. Mina cleared her throat and held her cup of ice cream. To us, we beat the shit out of our teachers. She got many looks from the surrounding people. Luckily, they were still wearing their UA uniforms, and many put the pieces together. Fuck them teachers. Denki joined in. The rest joined in with mock exasperated looks but had a genuine smiles on their faces. They ate as they chatted about something not related to UA. They talked about a movie coming out that they wanted to see in a group or a game that some showed interest in. The girls talked about heading to the mall to pick some things up for the camp coming up. Aizawa did say if we passed both exams we could go to the camp. I'm pretty confident I passed the written exam, Toru said to the group. Why don't we all go tomorrow after school or the weekend? The gang nodded their heads. I say the weekend, gives us more time to look around before it gets too dark, Kyoka said. I'm free, Honta put in. The rest agreed and made plans to go to the mall on the weekend as a group. They finished what food they had left and headed out to the train station. Denki unloaded any extra electricity to Izuku, and that reminded him to see if the support course was able to make a steady electricity generator. And maybe they would have some nuclear isotopes laying around. Izuku arrived at the empty apartment and tossed his bag in his room. He sat on the couch and thought about how to get a large amount of kinetic energy. His usual method was to leap off the tree in the clearing, but that would take too long. He could ask Uraraka to send him to the stratosphere and drop him, but he didn't know her well enough to ask her for that. Maybe piss off All Might and get punched a few times. He snorted at the idea. Izuku made a bead of thermal energy and watched it in his hand. He contained the thermal energy it released and redirected it back into the bead. The cycle made him think of absorbing the kinetic energy from the wind, but it hasn't been windy lately and it would be little at a time. He could find an airplane in flight and take its kinetic energy, but Izuku was sure that would mark him as a villain when the airplane stopped dead and plummeted to the earth. An earthquake would be an ideal opportunity for kinetic energy. He would save the area around him and gain who knows how much from the quake. He gave up on thinking and absorbed the bead that would glass the building. Maybe the support department would have an idea. He went to shower and head to bed as he thought about what Toru's favor would be. Sato and Kirishima, you both failed the practical exam. But luckily for you, everyone is coming to the camp this summer. Aizawa said and everyone cheered. The two cried in relief but soon stopped at Aizawa's next words. You'll be stuck with me in remedial classes to see where you failed. Here's the list of stuff you'll need for camp. He left and on the podium was a stack of papers for everyone to take one. Toru bounded up and took enough for her friends. She took one out of the stack and read as she held out the rest for Mina to distribute. Nothing surprising, she shrugged. I have most of this stuff, I think. Denki squinted at the paper. What about you, Zuko? Toru turned to him. I need most of this stuff, never went camping or the like. Izuku shook his head at everything he would need to buy. Toru linked arms with him and smiled at him. Good thing we are coming to help you carry everything. The gang made their way out of class and to the exit. Izuku split off from them and headed to the support department. Toru was going to join him but was pulled away by Mina. If Izuku had Kyoka hearing, he would have heard Mina begin to talk about helping Toru with getting together with Izuku. The rest of the gang chipped in to help anyway for the blushing invisible girl. Izuku knocked on the door of the support department and opened it. Midoriya, you here to test out the generator? Power Loader saw who it was and asked. Yes, I was never told it was finished. What? Hatsume never mind, come on. Let me show you. He cut himself off and glared at the pink-haired girl who didn't even look up. He led Izuku to a corner of the room and a cylindrical machine sat humming. It has a storage of 50 kilowatts and it generates its electricity until it's full. Give or take a few days to fill. Izuku inspected it in curiosity and then placed his hand on the output and drained it. A large amount of electrical coursed into his body and settled into his core. About 3 large lightning bolts. The small LED screen on the device showed it drop from 50 to 0 in a moment. How is it? Power Loader asked the unhinged boy. Good. Anything bigger? How bigger? How big can you get? I haven't found a limit to the amount I can store. The more I can have, the more I can use whenever I need to. If you make a nuclear power plant, I could drain every drop including the nuclear energy. He turned on his sixth sense and found a faint sense of nuclear energy behind a large metal door. Power Loader saw where he was staring and began to get nervous at the boy's attention to the sealed door. I can maybe make something bigger for electricity but nuclear energy is going to be a problem. Someone said nuclear. Hatsume's muffled voice was heard behind a lead apron and with face covering and metallic glove that covered her whole arms that held tongs holding a metal rod. Izuku's eyes zeroed in on the potent nuclear energy and yanked it all into his core. Power Loader screamed at Hatsume to get that away and Izuku approached to pick up the inert metal rod from the tongs. Hatsume tossed the protective equipment to the side and brought out a device and scanned both Izuku and the rod. She nodded and plucked it out of his hands and went to her station. Izuku followed out of curiosity. What was that? Izuku asked over her shoulder as she worked on the rod. She mumbled something as she worked and answered. Uranium rod, now a depleted uranium rod. She smiled a mad scientist smile. Izuku could see the potential before him. I'll do that whenever you need me to if you build me a source of electric energy. Not a small gas generator, I want something powerful. Hatsume turned from her work and her eyes zoomed in on every feature on his face. What capacity? She began to smile. I don't have one. Make a fucking nuclear power plant if you can and I'll take it all into my core. He began to smile at the contagious smile on the girl. Now, hold on. Power Loader was trying to slow them down. Also, any unique energies you find, tell me. He showed the small bomb from the villain during his internship. That's energy from a quirk, I'm not limited to natural energy I can absorb. Hatsume began to vibrate at the new project before her. Oh, how exciting. She turned to begin but Izuku pulled her back one last time. I want more kinetic energy. If you find a way for me to get more, here is my number. He wrote it down in his notebook and gave it to her. She snatched the paper and stuffed it in her overalls. Welcome my new customer. Look forward to working with you. Izuku was going to give her his name but paused. She didn't seem the type to remember. Flux, I'm happy to have someone so dedicated to their work. He smiled. She beamed and shook his hand with her grease-covered one. Flux, I like it, now buzz off and let me work. Power Loader looked on in panic at watching his most unstable student team up with the most unhinged boy in the hero department. The same unhinged boy that brought All Might to his knees in surrender with raw power alone. His panic grew as Hatsume pulled another uranium rod out of nowhere and he absorbed it for her benefit. Power Loader had seen what remained of the city the two fought in and the fire the boy used was not possible. Not even Endeavor's fire has ever gotten that hot. The gang made plans to head into the shopping district as a group on the weekend. For Izuku, the weekend was mostly spent at the apartment alone with the back of his mind drifting to the empty room down the hall and the sticky note in the junk drawer. But now he had something to distract him, his friends. He took some of his extra money and the debit card that kept getting funds put in even after Inko's departure. He put on a light jacket and headed out to meet up with the others. On the way, his mind drifted back to Inko. He had very mixed feelings about her. He had lost all love for her but why would she pay for the next 3 years on the apartment? Some part of his mind hoped now that he had a quirk she would try to reconnect with him but nothing of the sort happened. He felt anger flare up with sadness accompanying next to it. But what else could he do right now other than keep moving forward with his plans? His thoughts were thrown off kilter when an arm wrapped around his elbow. He looked over to see Toru giving him a worried look. His heart stuttered at her proximity. Is everything okay? She asked. He smiled warmly toward her and any thoughts from before were washed away completely. It is now, he said without thinking and his face burned at what he had said to her. Toru ducked her head and smiled, giddiness washing over her. Well, I'm happy to hear that. She held tighter onto his arm and looked up at his receding blush. Izuku cleared his throat and changed the subject with no tact. So, have you found what you are going to use your favor for? The train lurched and began to move again. Toru gave him a smile he couldn't interpret. I have a very good favor to ask, but I just have to find the right time. Her face flushed with heat that Izuku could see easily. Of course, you need the right time for me to cause a distraction for you to rob the bank. He nodded sagely. Toru laughed at him and bumped her shoulder with his. I'd figure you would be alright in case of heroes coming to stop you since you kicked All Might's ass not a week ago. I'd imagine you can take anyone at that point. Izuku smiled and laughed with her at their imagination of robbing a bank together. They stayed in companionable silence with her head on his shoulder and his hand on her arm. They basked in each other's presence until the stop came for them to get off. The rest of their friends joined the two since they were early. Kyoka came first and greeted the two. She internally rolled her eyes at them not getting together already but she let them be without pushing. Denki and Honta joined soon after with Mina running up to them almost being late. Everyone ready? When everyone nodded, Mina pointed forward and led them into the shopping district. Then let's go. In a group, they walked into the mall while joking around. Toru never let go of Izuku's arm as they walked store to either buy something or just to look around for fun. They got some looks from the crowd, some recognizing them from the sports festival. Izuku got the most attention since he won in the more brutal way possible. He caught some whispered conversations but he did his best to ignore them. Kyoka heard many too and shot glares at a few. Izuku felt grateful for her friendship. Right then, who needs what? I just need some small things here and there. Bug spray, travel necessities, sunscreen, and the like. Mina walked backward and spoke to them as a group. Denki furrowed his brow. Can you get sunburns? Mina scoffed. Of course, I can. Just because I'm pink you think I can't get sunburns? Denki raised his hands in surrender. That's why I was asking. You two done bickering. We are being left behind. Honta pointed at the other three walking into a storefront. Disgraceful, what would the boss say to this? He said in his gruff voice. Hey, since Izuku is the leader, what would that make us in the hierarchy? Mina began to follow the rest of her friends. Well, Toru was his right-hand woman. Of course, of course. Honta nodded along with Denki. We would have to be his lieutenants, right? Mina said. Kyoka barked out a laugh and turned to them. You're the grunts, she said with a smirk. How dare you? Honta said in mock offense. Boss, what are we? Izuku looked confused at them and shook his head. Embarrassing with all the attention you are drawing. Honta reeled back as if stuck. Boss, he said sadly as the others burst out laughing and pointing at him. They got many more looks from passers-by. They kept moving on with their shopping with the odd thing here or there tossed into their bags. Izuku was the biggest shopper since he didn't have many of the supplies to go camping since he'd never been camping. They had fun anyways throughout their day together. They were only kicked out of one shop when Denki knocked over a shelf from being spooked by Kyoka. Granted, the shelf was very wobbly, to begin with, but the owner was not happy with the mess. They had lunch in the dining area with greasy food on everyone's plates. Mina brought up something she was curious about. Izuku, she said with her mouth full. She swallowed when she got a glare from the green-haired boy at her manners. How many people do you have profiles for in your notebook? Izuku finished his bite of food and said. In that notebook, 47 people, hero or villains. They made noises of appreciation. Who do you decide to write in them? Anyone who seems to be a threat or interesting enough, either quirk or other abilities. He shrugged and bit into his burger again. Toru slid closer to him and said softly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. Which one am I? Was I interesting to you? A combination of her soft voice next to his ear and the way she asked made Izuku inhale his bit of food and began to choke immediately. His friends began to panic and then hero training kicked in. Honta jumped in first to give Izuku the Heimlich maneuver. It didn't take too much and Izuku was breathing again. I am so sorry, Toru said almost in tears. It's okay. I'm okay, he quickly said with a warm smile to reassure her. You were very interesting to me to answer your question. The red on his face was hard to tell if it was from what he had said or from not getting oxygen into his lungs. Toru gave him a wobbly laugh. Mina and Denki wiggled their eyebrow at each other and held in laughter. See that? I'm definitely getting promoted for saving the boss's life, Honta said proudly. Everyone sat down to finish their good after that and then continued to walk around the mall until they got everything everyone needed. They decided to call it a day and head home to their homes. They all walked to the train station while chatting among themselves. One by one they got off to switch trains and then it was only Izuku and Toru. He got off with her to wait for her train. It was Izuku's stop anyway so it worked out well. The station was empty and Toru shifted and then turned to Izuku. I want to ask for my favor. Now, Toru moved to face him. She had a determined face as she stood before him. Izuku smiled. All right. No questions asked. Toru's face burned slightly at what she is going to ask but he'd firm to her resolve. She pointed at him. I want the title of your girlfriend. And you my boyfriend. Izuku's smile froze and his mind flashed through memories of girls doing similar things to him only to laugh in his face and mock him for thinking they were serious. He felt cold sweat cover the back of his neck and tried to focus on the present. He reminded himself that Toru is different. She wouldn't do such a thing, even as a joke. But the back of his mind said she was lying and this will end just like before with him crying alone and hurt. He didn't want that. Toru watched Izuku's face flash with various emotions and she didn't know what to do. Panic began to rise and she quietly spoke. Izuku, if you don't want to, that's okay. I'm sorry I shouldn't have asked you something like that. She felt tears crop up at seeing Izuku distraught and for herself at this idea. He managed to hear her in time and focused on her. You're not joking. That is all he was able to say with his throat closing up. She shook her head vigorously. I would never joke about anything like this. I've liked you for a long time and wanted to find a good way to confess. I admire your determination, how kind you are to the people you care about, and how you look at me. You see me, not just where my voice is. I wouldn't ever hurt you in any way. Tears flowed down her cheeks but smiled up at him. She slowly took his hand as she spoke. Izuku gripped her hand in absolute hope. You won't leave me. He couldn't stop the croak in his voice and the stinging sensation coming from his eyes. She shook her head again. I won't. She beamed up at him and Izuku pulled her into a tight hug as she laughed into his chest. "I'll be your boyfriend, then." Izuku felt her arms wrap around him and hold him tight. "And I'll be your girlfriend." She giggled and tried to bury deeper into him. They stayed like that for a bit longer and then pulled apart. Toru wiped her face from tears with a smile. He couldn't contain his smile and held her fire hand while watching his girlfriend. She laughed when she caught him staring and squeezed his hand in response. "So, what now?" she asked. Izuku stopped for a moment. "I don't know." He didn't watch much TV or read any romance novels, so he didn't know where to proceed from there. Toru giggled again at the consternation on his face. She went back and hugged him again. "It doesn't matter, we do what we want," she hummed with the warmth radiating from her boyfriend. He hugged her back automatically while his mind flashed through thoughts of how to have a girlfriend. He should take her on a date, take care of her, and buy gifts. Right. Stop thinking so much, don't worry about it. She looked up at him from his arms to reassure him. All right, he nodded. What does it mean to have a girlfriend then? Logically he knew there was more, but he wanted her to give a layout at least for his comfort. She pulled back and hooked her arm with his. "It means we get to hold hands, hug, and be close together as much as we want." Izuku furrowed his brow. "Don't we already do that?" He raised an eyebrow at her. She laughed and leaned on him. "Or we can do more lewd things," she said softly and looked up at him. "Like cuddles," she whispered like it was a top secret thing. He recognized her joking tone and put on a look of disbelief. Before marriage, how devious. They stopped and burst out laughing together. Every time they calmed down and looked at each other again, they laughed again. When their stomachs were sore, they began to peter off. Toru leaned on him again and Izuku tentatively put an arm around her. She leaned closer and hummed in contentment. The train for Toru began to get close and they reluctantly got up. The train got close and it was empty for the most part. He walked her closer to the train and she spun in front of him again. She squirmed a bit but looked at him with more heat on her face. "It's only right for you to send me off with a kiss." Izuku blushed and nodded jerkily. He quickly tried to decide where. Forehead, no. Lips, too soon. Cheek, a safe bet, maybe. He was taking too long and saw Toru take the decision out of his hands. She leaned forward and kissed him on the lips before beaming up at him and quickly getting on the train before the doors closed. She smiled at him through the window as the train lurched away. Izuku stood there until the station was empty once again. His smile couldn't be contained as he turned back to the stairs and headed to the apartment. He heard some chuckling and turned to see the old couple from before. "Good on ya, lad." The old man raised his cane to him in salute. "Leave the boy be." The old woman huffed a laugh and swatted his arm. Izuku kept his smile and bowed slightly at the elderly couple. He heard them laugh a bit more as he walked down the stairs to the road to the apartment. His mind is still on Toru becoming his girlfriend. His smile widened more at the thought. His chest was filled with more warmth than any thermal energy could fill him. Izuku arrived at the apartment with his bags of supplies for the camp. He began to pack his bag for the week away coming soon. His smile never dropped as he kept thinking of Toru. When he was done, he went to his sketching notebook he had been working on for a bit. When Toru asked for a copy of his drawing from his analysis notebook, he had given her one, but now he was working on a few more. They were copies of pictures he took with his friends but with Toru drawn in with careful detail. He had half a dozen done and ready to give to her and he thinks it's a good time to do so. It could work as his first gift for her. After all, boyfriends give gifts to their girlfriends. He was interrupted from making dinner when his phone went off. The group chat with all his friends was pinging him. He opened it and saw multiple thumbs up emojis sent to him from everyone but Toru. He soon found out it was because they found out about Toru and him getting together as a couple. Toru had told Mina and Kyoka, and from there Mina told everyone, hence the emojis. He shook his head and smiled at his phone. The weekend ended and Izuku was on his way to UA to board the bus for camp. He and Toru talked most of their time apart and chatted about anything. Izuku mostly listened but was happy to hear her talk about her favorite show. His stop came and he headed to UA with his bag for the days to come. He found where he was supposed to meet up with his class and joined his friends. Hanta, Denki, and Mina gave him finger guns with sly smirks on all their faces. Izuku blushed but smiled at his friend's antics. Leave him be. Kyoka batted their hands down. Mina was the first to round up next to him. So, tell me, how was it? Izuku blushed more. How was what? Was the sun setting behind her as you confessed your feelings for each other? The wind blew her hair as she looked up to you and pleaded for your love. Mina narrated a scene she could see in her mind. Izuku relived the moment and was startled just a bit when her description was very close. Get your hands off him, hussy. Toru leapt onto Izuku's back and pushed Mina's face away. Izuku immediately grabbed onto her legs and stumbled forward to balance himself. He felt Toru's arms hug him from behind and her head on his shoulder. Izuku smiled at her close presence. How dare you call me a hussy? Mina said imperiously. Denki is the only hussy in my presence. She pointed at him. Hey, Denki said, offended. Not a week into dating and look at how shameless they are. Hanta teased. Toru stuck her tongue out at him but only Izuku saw and chuckled warmly. It's nice to see you again, he said. Toru hugged him tighter and pecked his cheek from over his shoulder in response. It's about time you two got together finally, Denki said with a smile to them. What? Why? Izuku asked, confused. It's been obvious that you two had feelings for each other for like ever, Mina shrugged and nodded with Denki. Did everyone know? Izuku blushed a bit at the realization. Yep, the four that are not on Izuku's back chorus. You were very oblivious, Mina jabbed with a teasing smile. Don't worry about it, Toru smiled at him over his shoulder. Izuku smiled in response and before he could say anything, Aizawa's voice drawled out, alright, everyone is here. Load your bags under the bus and get in, don't waste time. Toru didn't get off Izuku's back and he smiled warmly at her. He picked his and her bag up and tossed them in. Toru got off when Izuku got close to the doors and followed him in and chose a pair of empty seats for them. He naturally joined her and she hooked her arm with his and leaned in him. Izuku felt the warmth fill him as everyone settled down and the bus began to move. Izuku and his little gang of friends chatted while they rode the bus to wherever Aizawa was taking them. They were quiet since most of the class decided to take a nap, including Toru, who was snuggled up under Izuku's arm. For his part, he did his best to stay still and enjoy the feeling of Toru's head on his lap. After almost 2 hours, they stopped on the side of the road. Izuku gently woke Toru up and she smiled warmly at him before squeezing him and getting up. Everyone was stretching their legs as they looked over the railing into the forest. They saw a black car roll up to them and 3 figures walked out into them. Izuku immediately recognized the 2 women and mentally brought up their profiles. Compared to many heroes, the wild pussy cats are one of the better ones since they are focused on mountain and forest rescue. He also took note that they were meeting the class at a rest stop and not at the camp. Izuku subtly kept Toru close and tapped Hanta and whispered loud enough for Kyoka to hear as well. Something is fishy, not bad but odd why they would meet us here instead of at the camp. Hanta took a moment to come to the realization and Kyoka was already telling the other 2 of his gang. Is there something you think is more important than greeting your hosts? Aizawa's angry tone was aimed at Izuku and glaring at him. Izuku didn't break eye contact and said, yes, I was telling them why would our hosts meet us here instead of at the camp. So I told them to keep an eye out. You know, like you always say, to be prepared. Just the tiniest bit of snark leaked out. Aizawa kept glaring until Pixie Bob laughed. Oh, this one has claws. Mandalay looked between the student and the teacher in apprehension. Well, I guess the cat is out of the bag. Head straight west and good luck. Pixie Bob slammed her paws on the ground and the whole class fell to the forest. Izuku picked Toru into a princess carry and absorbed the fall. Hanta used his tape to grab Denki and slow their fall while Mina dug her fingers into the cliffside and slid down. Kyoka's earlobes slammed into the ground first and a blast of sound pushed her up to break her fall. They weren't the only ones to land on their feet. My hero. Toru giggled and jumped off Izuku's arms after a peck on the cheek. He composed himself quickly and focused on what Pixie Bob said about heading west. He looked at the sun and turned in the right direction. West we go. Izuku began to move with his gang of friends joining him. Shouldn't we stick together? Yaoyorozu said to the group leaving. Does it matter? We are all headed west, so head west. Izuku shrugged. No one got to say anything else as a creature of dirt emerged out of the ground. Izuku didn't let it finish building itself and blasted it with a concentrated thermal beam. The head turned to nothing and it collapsed. Oh, never mind. You were already using your quirks. Pixie Bob said, a bit deflated as she watched the lead group not hesitate to push forward. Mandalay noticed Aizawa's eyes on the green-haired boy and asked, "Is he going to be a problem?" He gave out a sigh and rubbed his face. "I don't know. He is one of the most complicated students I've ever had. He's cold to everyone but his close friends. He is smart enough to bring up two of the worst academic students in a few spots. And his quirk is extremely powerful." "Wow, what is it?" Pixie Bob joined in the conversation. "Energy absorbing and storage. He absorbs a kinetic strike and he can release it back at his opponent later. He's not limited to just one energy." Aizawa began to walk to the black car. The two rescue heroes looked at each other in surprise. "And the limit? How many can he store and how much?" Mandalay joined the tired hero in the car. Aizawa sighed again and answered, "I don't know. I don't think there is." "Come on." Pixie Bob laughed behind the steering wheel. "Why do you think there is no limit?" Aizawa thought about what he was about to say. "For the exams, we had the staff fight two students. Escape, pass. Beat the hero by capture, pass." He took in a big breath and said, "Midoriya was paired against All Might. He beat the number one hero into surrender with raw power and strategy. The other two heroes were quiet at the revelation. He was handicapped, right? That's how he won." Pixie Bob asked. "He was. The fire he shot out destroyed two city blocks, also melted the weights on his arms while charring the exposed flesh." "Oh, that is all either said for the rest of the trip." Denki ran forward with his enhanced body and bashed the dirt monster with a large branch he picked up. Mina was throwing controlled acid shots at range while Izuku picked up rocks and launched them at supersonic speeds through the beasts. He switched back to thermal energy and carved out chunks of dirt with his beams of pure thermal energy. "You know, I feel kinda useless right now." Toru walked behind her friends as they obliterated everything in their path. "I know how you feel," Kyoka said next to her. "Don't feel bad. Just let your man take care of the problem." Honta yelled back at them as he wrapped up the legs of one beast and Denki finished it off. Toru hummed in thought, "You know what, I like the sound of that. Izuku, get rid of those beasts for me," she said in a noble voice. "Why, of course, my lady." At once, Izuku played along and got what he wanted with giggles from Toru that warmed his chest. "Gods, you two are so adorable," Mina squealed before melting the chest of a beast. "I'm starting to get jealous," Denki said while taking a break. "How much further?" "Hold on." Izuku blasted one beast with sound and it crumbled apart. He jogged forward and blasted up into the air with kinetic energy. He found the campsite and he landed with no issue. "Maybe, halfway." Denki groaned and turned to their leader. "Can you just carve a way to the site? It'll be a waste of energy. The beasts will still come even if I carve a path with thermal energy." Izuku shook his head and resisted the thought of the amount of thermal energy he could get if he burned trees along the way. "Guys, I think I'm turning into a pyromaniac." "Well, don't, Toru. Is that a deal breaker?" Mina joked. "To be honest, I went through a pyro phase when I was younger," she said sheepishly. "God, a match made in heaven." Honda laughed while swinging back and forward to distract a beast for Mina to splash it with acid. They kept on fighting through the forest with an occasional break here or there. They haven't seen the rest of the class but they could still hear the occasional explosion behind them. The two girls behind the group did get a chance to do something when a few beasts came at them from behind. Izuku would have taken care of it but Toru waved him off and charged forward with Kyoka. They were the first to arrive at the campsite, tired but victorious. They saw the bus they arrived on but no one else. Izuku shrugged and moved to sit on the picnic tables nearby. The rest followed and plopped around their leader. "You know, I'm pretty grateful that it's a nice day out and not sweltering," Denki said leaning back on the seats. "Yay, you're right. The sun is warm but there's a cool breeze." Kyoka nodded. Toru leaned on Izuku's shoulder but didn't get any closer since they were all sweaty and gross. "So, what now? Should we go wander inside or something?" Toru felt cooler than she did apart from Izuku. She raised an eyebrow at him but he only smiled. They sat and waited for a few minutes longer until Mandalay walked out with Pixie Bob and Aizawa. They all turned to them and Izuku gave them a lazy wave. Aizawa kept his neutral face and turned away after looking them over. The other two were surprised at their speed but didn't say anything. Izuku noticed another heat source coming through the doors. A boy around 5 walked out and crossed his arms with an annoyed face. Izuku saw that emotion and see himself mirror it when he was younger. That saddened Izuku more than he thought but he didn't show it. Pixie Bob strolled up to them. "Well, aren't you all fast?" She chuckled. "But you left your class behind and why is it cooler here?" "Because we're the cool kids." Denki posed and got smacked on the back of the head by Kyoka. "We were never told to stay together, just head west." "We did so." Izuku didn't respond about the area being cooler. "Who's that?" Izuku nodded to the boy who was glaring at them. "That's Kota. Come say hello," Mandalay said trying to introduce her nephew. Izuku motioned to the seat beside him on the bench. "The area is cooler around me. Come sit if you like." "Why would I want to be anywhere near some hero wannabe?" The boy sneered. "Kota," Mandalay said reproachfully, "you don't like heroes." "I don't like many of them either. The wild pussycats are alright though." He kept trying to talk to the boy but he got a furrowed brow look from the boy and Izuku patted the empty spot next to him for Kota to sit. He didn't move closer. The adults also gave him a look but Mandalay was more grateful for trying to connect with her nephew. They didn't get to say anything else as the rest of the class stumbled out of the treeline and into the campgrounds. Once the members of the WWPC finished talking they sent them to eat. They all gave them grateful looks and made their way to the cafeteria. When everyone was done eating their fill, they went to the baths. After a quick shower, Izuku joined the rest of the class in the hot outdoor bath. Izuku sunk into the hot water with his upper body exposed. Scars over scars littered his chest and shoulders. From burned scars to cuts. Izuku didn't care for the stares and slowly sunk into the hot water until the water was at his chin. He hummed in pleasure and added some of his thermal energy to the water. "Izuku, I'm pretty sure you're not supposed to boil everyone." Denki snarked at the heating water. "Just a little boiling is fine." Honta mimicked Izuku and sunk into the hot water next to his friends. "Hey, Midoriya," Kirishima asked. Izuku hummed in response. The redhead continued. "Are you and Hagakure dating?" Izuku rose so he could speak without water rushing into his mouth. "Yes, we are. Why are you asking?" Kirishima gave him a shark-toothed smile. "Congratulations. I was just curious was all." Sato, Shoji, and Tokiyami gave him nods as well. Izuku smiled a bit. "Thanks." When everyone was sufficiently pruned by the near boiling water, they made their way to their sleeping area. They were told that they will have an early start so everyone got situated for bed. Izuku found one corner and lay down. Denki and Honta chose spots next to him and Izuku felt better about sleeping in an open area like he was. Some of the guys chose to play some card games before sleep but Izuku didn't join. His back facing the wall, he fell asleep to the sound of the others talking softly. "So, what is Midoriya like?" Uraraka asked of the invisible girl when the girls sat in their room to sleep. "Ooh, girl talk." Mina giggled and sat next to Toru. "I mean I already know but go on." "I am also curious about your relationship with Midoriya. He is one of the most complicated guys I've met. He is thoughtful like at the sports festival to warm the area after Todoroki's match for me. And then he does something like at the exam with All Might or his match against Bakugo." Tsuyu joined in next to Uraraka. Yaoyorozu didn't say anything but it was obvious that she was also interested in the conversation. Toru shifted in her seated position. "He has good reasons for what he does. He is very good at keeping things apart, like how he treats anyone else but Bakugo." She curled her lip at the name at the end. "But forget that, we just got together on the weekend and he's been so sweet so far." She squealed. "Like what?" Uraraka almost bounced around. "He's so gentle when I'm around him, small things like that." She smiled to herself and thought about her boyfriend. "They are so sweet that I'm pretty sure I'm getting a cavity just from their proximity." Kyoka chuckled. They kept chatting for a bit longer until one began to get drowsy and they all decided to go to sleep. Toru lay down and fell asleep, imagining Izuku falling asleep with his arm around her. So far this year we have been pushing you in experience and technique with both your quirk and other abilities. Now, you are here to stretch your quirks, like a muscle. You will tear it and rest it over and over to improve your output. Aizawa drawled to his class as most were still rubbing their eyes clean. He tossed a familiar baseball to Izuku. He caught it and moved forward. He knew what Aizawa was trying to say, but his quirk is very different from others. Everyone's quirk can stretch and strengthen, but he can only put out what it takes in. If he had the same amount of energy from the beginning of the year, then the distance will be the same. So, he will improve his methods with his quirk. He raised his open hand and a bead of the sun coalesced at the palm of his hand. He concentrated on the distance of the blast. He released and a bar of liquid fire exploded into the air when he stopped firing and threw the ball with about the same amount he used on the first day of UA. It rocketed forward and broke the sound barrier as it traveled along the path of the flames. What was the reason for the fire? Aizawa raised an eyebrow. Air expands when heated. I made a tunnel of thinned air for a more efficient throw using the same amount of energy I used on the first day. Izuku gestured to the device he was holding for the readout. Aizawa looked at the device and it read 718.1 meters, over 150 meters more than before. You get the idea. We will split you up with the right groups for your quirk. Midoriya, with me. Aizawa let the class get separated by the hero team and waited for Izuku to join him. Izuku stayed where he was standing and watched his classmates get split up for their quirk. He didn't speak and waited for his teacher to begin. Aizawa stared at Izuku and he stared back with a raised brow. Aizawa sighed at the problematic student. You could have been expelled for your stunt during the midterm exam. Izuku tilted his head and stared back at Aizawa. Why would I be expelled and why didn't you? He asked with no inflection in his tone of voice. Because you went too far in the exam and on top of that you missed the whole point of the exam to work on your weaknesses. I treated the exam how I would treat it in real life. If I ever go against a person with the power of All Might, I will take the threat down before he could level a city. He said with all seriousness. As for why I didn't work with Bakugo, it was unnecessary. Would you take out a single target with two people when one is sufficient? As you said, it's illogical. Why wasn't I expelled? Izuku had a very good idea why not. Aizawa narrowed his eyes at his student when he threw his words back at him. It's safer to keep you close than have you leave UA. Izuku scoffed. I stay at UA of my own volition. I have plans in case I didn't like how UA was, how it could have reminds me of Aldera. What kind of plans? Aizawa furrowed his brows at the boy. Various kinds. Izuku shrugged noncommittally. This isn't going to work for me, I don't have a limit I can stretch. He waved at the rest of his class using their quirks to the limit and further beyond. Aizawa furrowed but answered anyway. Show me how many energies you can absorb. Kinetic, electric, thermal, sound, light, nuclear, and quirk energy. He rattled off. Quirk energy. He raised an eyebrow. Izuku made a small bead of green energy on the tip of his finger and flicked it to the ground. He commanded it to detonate and a tiny pop went off. Some guy during the internship trying to use me and a lady as hostages. I absorbed the energy he produced and he can make bombs. Aizawa nodded at his explanation and went on. What range can you absorb something? So long as there is an energy between each source, I don't think I have a range or I haven't found one yet. Explain. He rolled his hand. Thermal energy can be continually absorbed since there is always more thermal energy in the air to be drawn in. Imagine a bubble expanding so long as there's more nearby. That but for everything, I think. Izuku held his hand like he was containing a ball and steadily expanding the size. Aizawa was quiet for a moment as that sunk in. With a sigh he continued. Then you will work on precision. Izuku opened his hand and shot out a dozen beams of fire. A dozen little flames danced on the ground. Pick two. Aizawa furrowed his brow and pointed at two very near others. They were extinguished as the flames turned into streams of fire and were sucked into Izuku's hand. I exclusively work on control and techniques for using my quirk since I get energy when I see an opportunity for it. And you don't have to work on the speed of absorption. Aizawa scowled slightly. What are you lacking then? Physical training. The only reason I went with Endeavor for my internship was to take his fire and get hand-to-hand combat training. Izuku opened his palm to show a flame that had the distinct coloration of the number 2 hero. Aizawa grunted and pointed to Tiger with other students. With him and later find an empty spot and absorbed as much energy as you can without disturbing the others. Izuku didn't say anything and turned and left. He stretched and joined in with what Tiger was doing. Once he had a good sweat and his body ached with every movement, he walked over to Todoroki and had him shoot flames at him while he absorbed anything he could. For a few hours, that was how he spent his day. Every once in a while he looked over to Toru as she shot beams of light in every direction she could and as fast as she could. When he got tired of flames and went over to Denki, and he did the same to Izuku as Todoroki did. One good thing about the camp was that he was gaining a large amount of energy. Izuku was the only one who wasn't dragging their feet to cook their dinner. His training so far has been physical and led by Tiger. While a sore, he didn't have quirk exhaustion like everyone else did. His quirk didn't tire him when he used it. The only limit he had found with his quirk was what he had stored in his core. He was pretty happy with it. The ingredients were laid out for them to cook and there were multiple outdoor stoves for them to use. Everyone decided to work on a stew and Izuku immediately began to get to work. He lit the wood stoves and set the pots of water to heat up. After that, he began to slice up the ingredients with practiced motions that caught his friend's eyes. Toru watched him from his elbow. "You're like a pro. Who taught you to cook?" "Yay, not even my mom can work as well as you can in the kitchen," Denki complimented. Izuku paused for a second and continued. "No one taught me, I'm just had good practice." He dumped the cubed meat into the pot. Toru bit her lip and looked worried at what he said. Looking around, she could see their gaggle of friends also caught what he had said. "What else can you cook up?" She injected cheer into her tone. Izuku looked over at her and smiled. "A few things, nothing fancy, but maybe one day I'll cook something up for you." His ears burned slightly at the proclamation. Toru ducked her head and bumped it against his arm. "I would like that," she said softly, and a smile hidden from view. "Get a room." Mina looked around to see who said that, even though it was obvious to everyone it was her. Izuku cleared his throat and focused back on cooking even though his smile was evident to everyone. Toru helped where she could and the others copied Izuku's motions to cook for their pot of stew. The rest of the class did their own thing and cooked at their stations. When the food was done, everyone sat down with bowls to eat as a group. His group of friends thoroughly enjoyed their meal and filled their bowls for seconds. While eating, Izuku noticed Kota go into the woods and made note of it. The rest of the day was theirs and most spent it resting from the grueling training hours before. Izuku did the same and found a spot to sit and rest his sore muscles. Toru joined him and leaned against him. They didn't speak and basked in each other's presence. Izuku cooled the area and they had a nice breeze blowing over them. The next day was similar to the day before. They got up early and then went to their training areas. Izuku went to an empty field and absorbed one energy at a time in a large radius. He switched as fast as he could between energies, but for him it was instant. 1 second it's a black void around Izuku and then everything is visible but mute to the point it's disorienting. The dirt crumbled from intense heat and froze with fog close to the ground. The ground shattered from the kinetic blast outward and then everything went still as everything near was stopped by the absorbed kinetic energy. From a distance, it looked like an apocalypse over and over again. When the adults called it a day and they finished eating, Ragdoll gathered them around to have some fun. A test of courage. 1B will go into the woods and prep an area to scare 1A coming through, she said giddy. Izuku's class was paired off and he was with Ojiro. Toru came up to them and just as she was going to say something. "No switching." Mandalay's voice reached them. Toru pouted and sulked off with a dejected look back at Izuku. He gave her a reassuring smile and nodded to Ojiro in greeting. He nodded back. Izuku never had a reason to speak to the boy. When he was doing his analysis on everyone in the class to see if any of them would be a threat to him in any way, he ranked close to the bottom. Mandalay began to send them into the woods in intervals. Toru paired with Jiro was the second pair to go in. Izuku smiled a bit at hearing the distant yelps of fear and waited for them to be sent in. His smile faded when he smelled smoke in the air and saw the blue glow in the distance. He sensed a wave of heat coming from the glow and Mandalay saw the same. They talked about it being an accident, but a villain jumping out of the woods with a large makeshift sword confirmed it was an attack. Izuku's fear blossomed in his chest at the thought of Toru. He ignored what the villains were saying and could only think of Toru getting ambushed. Kota, head back to the building now. His thoughts were thrown back to the present and his feet skidded to a stop just as he was going to blast off to find her. Fuck. Izuku cursed loudly and turned to where he had seen Kota walk into the woods alone the day before. He had to trust Toru to take care of herself. She was training to be a hero just like him and she had Jiro with her. I'll find him, he shouted back and blasted into the air and ruining his pair of shoes. He was high in the air and could see a lot of the forest before him. He saw a few outcroppings of stone scattered and focuses on them to start. He scanned 3 before finding 2 shapes on one. A small one and a hooded one. He blasted down and sped up like a ballistic missile aimed right at the cloaked figure approaching Kota who was backing away. Izuku ignited his hands and a comet collided with the figure. He came to a dead stop and then a blast of kinetic and thermal energy sent the cloaked figure flying. Fire bloomed out and Izuku turned to Kota who was shaking in fear and tears covered his face. We need to go. Izuku picked the small boy up and blasted off into the air with a yelp of fear from the child. It's him, Kota whispered, clutching at Izuku. Who is who? Izuku asked just as a large figure jumped from the ground they left and tackled Izuku and Kota out of the air. Izuku shielded the boy with his body and absorbed the crash landing. Izuku was cut from the branches they fell through and came to a stop. He looked over at Kota and was relieved to see him unharmed. He turned around at the sound of a tree branch breaking and saw the figure of Muscular. He was in one of Izuku's notebooks and he was very aware of what could have happened if Izuku didn't go for Kota instead of Toru. You pack a punch. And you were one of my targets. How? Izuku didn't let him finish as he blasted a beam of liquid fire at the serial killer. Muscular covered his face with his arms and the muscle were burned away quickly. He moved to the side and the burnt muscles were covered by new muscles. Izuku pushed Kota away as the villain charged at him. He absorbed the punch he threw and the next few until the villain picked him up and threw him against a tree. Izuku was fine but Muscular didn't let up and kicked Izuku to no effect. He was burned by a lightning bolt hitting his chest and shoulder. He convulsed for a moment and Izuku slipped away from being pinned. Izuku retaliated by launching a kinetic strike at his leg but the muscles absorbed most of the impact. He was batted away as Muscular regained his faculties. You're fun. But I want to see blood. Muscular cried in joy and charged forward. Izuku coated himself in scorching fire and met the charge. He blinded the villain with a flash of light and tried to grab onto him to absorb the kinetic energy of his body to knock him out. He was able to grab him by the neck but Muscular yanked him off and threw him again. Izuku growled in anger at being held up from looking for Toru. He saw Kota frozen in fear behind Muscular and the villain didn't miss it. He turned around to see and turned back with a vicious grin. Izuku howled in anger as Muscular turned around to smash the small boy into a paste. Izuku began to coalesce 2 beads of fire but it wouldn't be fast enough to stop Muscular who was already halfway to Kota. Izuku blasted off the ground and reached the villain and absorbed the electric energy in his body. Muscular collapsed like a puppet, his strings cut. Once he was down, Izuku senses the electricity in Muscular's body appear again but he didn't move. Kota stared at the villain who killed his parents face down and Izuku standing on top of his bulked form. Izuku was dirty and cut up from the landing with bruises on his body from Muscular grabbing him. What remained of his shirt showed a multitude of scars over his chest. We need to go, Izuku repeated, sucking in lungfuls of breath. Is he dead? Kota asked with a tremble in his voice. No, come on. Izuku picked up the boy and blasted off again to the building ahead. Izuku had theories of what would happen if he pulled energy from a living being. Thermal will kill them from the temperature shock and if he yanked all the thermal, then they will be frozen solid. Kinetic energy would knock them out from oxygen deprivation and make them have a stroke by stopping their heart by yanking the energy. Electric energy would most likely cause their limbs to stop responding because of the electrical signals being interrupted and if yanked, they will either lose control of their body or go brain dead from the loss of electric energy in their brain. He had sensed the electric energy in Muscular's brain and it wasn't right anymore and he didn't care. Izuku saw the buildings and Eraserhead fighting against a villain. The villain shot blue flames and then they were cut off by Eraserhead's quirk activating again. While in the air, Izuku aimed a hand at the villain and a lightning bolt speared through the villain. It dissolved into mud and Eraserhead looked up at who shot at his opponent. Izuku landed with no impact and set Kota down. His face was still covered in tears but he was safe. "Take Kota, I have to go." Izuku began to run back into the woods but Aizawa called out. "No, you are staying here, it's too dangerous for you to go out there," Aizawa said in a no-nonsense voice. He pulled the young boy and waited for Izuku to follow him. Izuku glared back at his homeroom teacher. "I'm going." Then he covered his body in the void just as Aizawa activated his quirk to stop him. He wasn't able to enjoy the shock on his face as Izuku's quirk didn't deactivate as he had something more important to do. He blasted off and disappeared into the woods. With consecutive bursts of kinetic energy, Izuku propelled himself over the woods and where the trail began for the test of courage. His mind raced as he began to scan frantically for Toru and his friends. He spotted 3 figures, 2 fighting and 1 pinned near a tree. He dropped and only saw it was Uraraka and Tsuyu. He startled them and without waiting, blasted the female villain with sound energy. She cried in agony and clutched her ears, any glass on her shattered and she fell to her knees. He blasted forward and hit her with his knee at full force causing her to slump to the ground. "That way to the buildings." Izuku pointed to his classmates and didn't wait for them to respond. He blasted off again and began to look. He saw more battles but didn't stop like he did for the last one. He saw lighting being shot out and fire in another area. He was sure they would be all right. He began to worry when he saw a purple mist close to the ground. He landed before it and experimentally ignited his hand. The mist burned away and then he increased the temperature as it moved away from him. He ran and stretched his senses to find any thermal signatures. Finally, he found them. Kyoka and Toru laying on the ground. He rushed to them and checked on their pulses. They were alive but he didn't know what the mist was. He tried to wake them up but they were unresponsive. A few tears leaked out of his eyes at seeing Toru as she was but he focused on getting them back to camp and to safety. He couldn't leave either behind so he took off his tattered shirt and made strap the lighter of the 2 to his back and carried Toru in his arms. With a grunt of effort, he began to make his way back. He absorbed each footfall to dampen the impact for the 2. Thankfully he didn't have to go far how he was as Mina and Hanta found him. They rushed over and took Kyoka off his back but Izuku held Toru close. They were unharmed but didn't need to say much as they moved in the direction of the camp. Izuku continued to worry for his friends and the girl in his arms that still hasn't shown any reaction. Izuku heard a noise and sensed someone in the trees behind him getting close fast. Everything behind Izuku was pushed back with a kinetic wave and Izuku turned around to glare at who stopped them. A masked villain landed nimbly and took off his top hat. Well, aren't you fast? Let me introduce myself. I am Compress with the Vanguard Action Squad of the League of Villains. I have one of my objectives and you are my other. He moved forward and a blue marble was tossed at Izuku. Izuku saw the marble turn into a boulder and he shattered it with a concentrated blast of sound energy. He kept track of the villain through his senses as Mina shot acid at him and Hanta kept Kyoka safe. Leave now, Izuku growled at the villain. No can do, not until. He was cut off by Izuku roaring in fury at being stopped from getting Toru to help. A bead of blue-white coalesced in front of Izuku's mouth and liquid fire exploded at the villain. He dodged but was caught in the fire. He yelled in pain and clutched at his now missing elbow. What remained was a charred stump with a blackened bone sticking out. The villain looked in fear at the boy who was looking at him again and another blinding white bead was forming. Compress saw the willingness to kill in his eyes and ran while clutching his arm. He threw whatever he could behind him as he ran as fast as he could. With the villain gone, Izuku turned back to his friends and they nodded at him and they got moving again. They ran into others from his class and 1B as they made it back to camp. Many students were back and prepared to help wherever they could. Izuku got Toru back to safety with no shoes and a missing shirt. His scars were very clear for everyone to see as Izuku found a place to set Toru down. He was still frustrated at the helplessness as he looked down at Toru's unmoving form. Many other students were in a similar situation as they were unconscious. The remaining group of friends gathered around Izuku, hovering over Toru's form and Jiro near her. Mina held Izuku's shoulder as they couldn't do anything to help. All they could do is wait for help. Izuku looked out into the forest and he could still see the blue glow from the fire. He had to do something to keep his mind off of the unmoving girl, and he got up. "Izuku, where are you going?" Mina asked worriedly. Izuku waved her concerns away and ignored the question from Aizawa again as his body was covered in the void. He blasted off and rocketed toward the fire. He focuses his anger on speeding up, and he arrived over the blazing fire. He could see police and ambulances on the road headed to the camp. He dove down to the fire and landed in the center. From above, a news helicopter began to record the fire and the scenery for the news coverage. Everyone in the helicopter focused on the forest fire as a small part was snuffed out. In the center of the snuffed out part was a figure. There was too much smoke to see properly, but they all could see the snuffed out section expand outwards. Like a hurricane of fire, it was all sucked into one spot. As more was pulled into the figure, more ice covered where they stood. What was left was ash as the raging fire was taken into someone in the center of the storm. When the fire department and water heroes arrived where the fire should have been, instead, they found a barren frozen wasteland with nothing but ash contained in it. Not a single burned tree or shrub remained, only ash. Izuku returned to camp with more thermal energy than he could imagine, but he couldn't celebrate. He arrived just as the ambulances got to the camp and the police followed behind. He rejoined his gang of friends and Mina gave him a brief hug of relief. Denki and Honta both had similar expressions to her. Paramedics began to run around and load the unconscious students onto the vehicles. Izuku wanted to go with Toru, but he couldn't do anything other than get in the way, so he let her and Jiro get loaded onto the back of an ambulance and drive off. Mina pulled Izuku to an area where medics were checking over non-critical injuries. He just now noticed how his classmates were acting. Mina caught his eyes. Bakugo is missing. Dead or kidnapped? Kidnapped. Todoroki was with him, and he was sucked into a marble by a villain. I already told Aizawa we fought the guy, or at least you did. Mina explained. Izuku gave a hum in response. You don't care that he's missing? Him? No. Izuku shook his head. She quirked the corner of her mouth up at that and leaned closer. I don't either, she whispered. Izuku smiled for once since everything started. He just hopes Toru will be alright. He sat down in front of a paramedic and was checked over by them. They checked his head for injuries and asked questions. He could see their eyes wandering up at his chest and back where his scars lay, but they didn't ask. Once everyone was checked over, they were loaded up on the bus and headed out to the hospital to get healed and get reports given out. He was given a shirt and sandals by Yaoyorozu and he thanked her for her thoughtfulness. Classes 1A and 1B were funneled into the same hospital for healing. Many of those in 1B were affected by the mist since they were deeper in the forest waiting for the test of courage. 1A mostly had minor injuries, the worst being Shoji losing one of his hands, but he said it would grow back. Izuku was the most banged up with his bruises and cuts from the branches. The only ones in 1A who were affected by the mist were Toru, Kyoka, and Yaoyorozu to a lesser extent. His mind went back to Toru's limp body on the forest ground next to Kyoka. Anger boiled at the situation. Once again, they were targeted by the League of Villains on a school trip. The first time was mostly due to them targeting All Might and him not being at the USJ. They had broken into UA and gotten the schedule. But now, it couldn't be a coincidence that they happened to know where the training camp was. Eraser had even said it was secluded, and no one would have been told until they arrived for their safety, so much for that. Their mission was for him and Bakugo to be kidnapped. He was brought out of his thoughts as the doctor saw him finish up his healing. This was one of the first times he was healed by a doctor and the first time in a hospital. His bruises were just about gone but his cuts were to heal naturally. He thanked the doctor and headed out to find the attending nurse. He asked about Toru and was directed to a room but wasn't allowed to go in since doctors were examining her and Kyoka for the effects of the mist. He found a small waiting area near her room and his friends were already there. Mina, Denki, and Honta sat in quiet as they were lost in thought. Izuku didn't speak up and sat next to them. Mina looked at who sat next to her and gave him a small smile. How are you doing? Mina asked. The other two turned to Izuku as well. Izuku sighed and rubbed his forehead, angry that we were attacked in a supposedly secluded camp and worried. There is nothing he can do to help Toru except to wait. Mina nodded. She sniffed and wiped her eyes. Yay, me too. Her voice wobbled. Izuku put an arm around her shoulder, and she cried into his. Denki gritted his teeth and clenched his fists, feeling similar to Izuku. Honta showed no exterior emotions but was in the same boat as them. A few minutes later, they were brought out of their thoughts by the door to Toru's and Kyoka's room opening, and two doctors walked out. The gang of friends jumped them and began to ask questions. Will they be all right? What did that mist do to them? Mina was the first to speak for them all. The doctors backed away slightly at the suddenness but composed themselves at a familiar situation. The older one spoke. We drew blood and had a toxicology test on them both. It was a sleeping agent who knocked them out. It will have to run its course until they wake up. How long will it take? A week at most, a few days at least. He answered before they could ask. Can we go in? Izuku asked. The younger doctor looked at them and asked. You were part of her class. They nodded, and she gave a small smile. Please be quiet, and she waved them at the door. They gave their thanks and moved past them into the room. Denki opened the door, and they funneled into the room. Izuku stared at Toru in a hospital gown, covered in hospital bed sheets. She looked as if she was sleeping and looking at Kyoka. She was the same. Honta pulled an extra chair from the corner of the room and set it next to the other two. Mina pulled Izuku to a chair, and he sat next to Toru's bed. They didn't say anything and just stayed close to their friends. Have you guys told your parents yet? Denki broke the silence of the room. With what phone, dummy? Mina snorted softly. Right, I forgot. Denki chucked self-deprecating. I'm sure the school has already taken care of that. I'm curious, though, how they will find us. Honta said with reason. They all shrugged and began to trade stories from their time apart at the camp. They didn't have much to tell. They were on the trail, and then they noticed the blue glow of the fire and figured out something was wrong. When they heard an explosion go off by Bakugo and a glacier of ice followed it, they knew they were under attack. They backtracked and got lost for a bit until they found Izuku and the others. Denki, for his part, helped out Tokiyami and Dark Shadow when the quirk went feral when Shoji got hurt. His lightning was enough for Dark Shadow to calm down, but he was drained of electricity. Izuku told them his side of the story by having to decide whether to go for Kota or Toru. His fight with Muscular and the state he left him after getting Kota to safety. Then, I'm looking for Toru and Kyoka while helping Uraraka and Tsuyu on the way. And then finally finding them. You did the right thing, Izuku. If you went after Toru and left Kota, Muscular would most likely have killed him. Toru and Kyoka are both trained to be heroes. They aren't defenseless. You helped with that, and they are all right, just sleeping is all. Mina reassured Izuku, churning thoughts. She's right. You did what was right. You saved the civilian and trusted the others to take care of themselves. That's something we learned. Denki added to Mina, and Honta nodded along with him. I suppose you're right, I just hate seeing them like that. Izuku waved at the two. We all do, Mina said. They stayed quiet for a moment, and a few minutes later, Aizawa peeked through the door and opened it when he saw them. He checked over them all and then the two in beds. He turned back to the others. Your families are downstairs. He looked at Mina, Denki, and Honta. He turned to Izuku. We haven't been able to reach yours. Any way to contact them? They all looked at Izuku, and he shook his head. No, I'll be staying here for a bit longer. He said truthfully. His friends gave him worried looks, but Izuku shook his head, and they let it be for now. Aizawa, on the other hand, stared at Izuku with an unreadable expression. Izuku turned to his friends. You should all get going. They will be worried for you all. Mina got up and pulled him into a hug before stepping away. Denki and Honta both gave him waves, and they made their way downstairs with worried expressions about Izuku and what relationship he had with his family. Aizawa escorted them downstairs and left Izuku alone in the room with the two. Later, Izuku was lost in thought. Aizawa came back with the bag he packed to go camping. He took it and nodded in thanks. We need to contact your family. I'll be fine. I'll be staying here for a bit longer. Izuku sat down again and took his phone out and pocketed it. He turned a glare at Aizawa. How were they able to find us? I thought it was supposed to be a secluded site. He questioned. Aizawa saw the deflection but went with it. We don't know. He shook his head. Once as a coincidence, twice as a pattern. The League knew where the staff room was for the schedule, and now they knew where we were at. He left the implications unsaid. Aizawa sent a sharp look at the boy before him. Those are dangerous words. Did any staff know the location? Izuku tilted his head and kept going, keeping his voice even. If not, then who else would know? Pointing fingers will end badly if there is no concrete proof, Aizawa said equally even. Next are the students. We arrive at the camp, and they let them know where. Or bring a tracker on their person. That's enough. Will it be enough when another attack happens and someone dies instead of that shit stain getting kidnapped? Izuku growled out. Aizawa was interrupted from answering by two adults rushing to Toru's bed. The parents of the invisible girl looked over their child in bed with some worry and anger. They didn't notice the other two standing in the room until the man looked up. The woman had almost neon yellow curly hair and the same color eyes. She stood a bit over Izuku's height of 5 feet 5, and was slim. The man had dirty blonde hair pulled back that was coming undone. The color reminded him of Bakugo. He stood over 6 feet tall and was broad-shouldered. Who are you? The father asked. The woman looked up with tears in her eyes at the two. Izuku sheepishly lowered his hand. He aimed at them when he was startled at the sudden intrusion. I'm Izuku Midoriya. He bowed slightly in greeting. Aizawa Shota, their homeroom teacher. Aizawa introduced himself. Izuku, Toru spoke much about you. The woman said, wiping tears away and looking him up and down. She turned back to her daughter in bed. I only wish we met in better circumstances. What happened? I thought she was supposed to be safe at that camp. The man turned to Aizawa with anger in his eyes. We do not know how they found the location of the camp. No one but the staff on site was to know the location in Nezu. He explained. At the corner of his eye, he could see Izuku giving him the same glare at him. If you excuse me, he made to leave, and no one stopped him. Izuku awkwardly stood there as the two parents of his girlfriend turned to him. Can you tell us what happened? The mother asked. Izuku nodded and told them what happened during the attack. He explained the test of courage and then the fire. He went on to tell them how he found her and how they made it back to camp. I'm sorry I couldn't do anything more, he said. The man sighed and sat in one of the chairs. You did what you could, lad. We were already told about the effects, but seeing her like this. He shook his head, and Izuku agreed. I'm sorry, my name is Nagai, and my husband is Makoto. It's been a day, and by the sounds of it, you have too. Nagai introduced the two. Izuku gave a faint smile in greeting and then stood up to leave. I'll leave you two for some privacy. He bowed slightly and turned to leave. Hold on. Nagai stopped him and pulled him into a tight hug. Thank you for being there for Toru. We'll speak again in better circumstances. She pulled him arm's length away and held his shoulders with a teary smile. Makoto nodded and gave him a faint smile as well. Izuku's throat closed up, and he cleared it. I'd like that. He smiled a bit and gave one last look at Toru's sleeping face and left with his bag. Izuku left the hospital in the early morning and made his way to the train station. He boarded it alone with no one around. He arrived at the apartment around 3 a.m. The first thing he did was take a shower. When he was done, he saw that he had multiple messages from the chat room saying the others were home and to let them know when he was home as well. He smiled a bit at that and sent a message to confirm his safety. After cooking up some breakfast, he went to bed and into a fitful sleep. Izuku woke up late. It was a bit after noon, and he was still tired. He got up anyway and showered again to rinse off the sweat from his body. He sat in the living room with nothing to do. His mind kept going back to Toru even though he knew she was as safe as she could be. The hospital they were taken to was frequented by heroes and high-profile people. The security would be higher than most. But UA was supposed to be the same. With that, he packed a bag and some things to distract himself and headed back to the hospital. He had nothing better to do, and there was nothing left for him at the apartment. He sent a message to the chat room that he was headed over to visit Toru. The train ride was filled with conversations about the attack at the camp. Izuku did his best to ignore it, but it was hard with screens showing news coverage of the incident. They even showed a clip of him absorbing the forest fire from above. He had to admit, it looked pretty cool. Toru was the same as she was the night before. Her parents weren't in the room. The only other person inside was Kyoka in her bed. Izuku sat down on the small couch against the wall facing the two beds and settled in. He pulled out a book to read, but it was hard to concentrate, and he had to reread passages multiple times. Hours passed, and he got sick of trying to read. Instead, he pulled out the sketchbook he was planning to gift Toru. He still had a few more pictures he could copy over and draw Toru into them. So, that's what he distracted himself with until Denki, Mina, and Honta joined him in the room. Mina and Honta pulled up chairs, and Denki sat next to Izuku on the couch. They chatted quietly as time passed on. All their parents were unsure to leave them out of their eyesight, but they managed to convince each one of them. When they got hungry, two split off and brought back takeout for the others. It was a difficult time for all of them. Another day passed the same way until all of 1A showed up at Toru's and Kyoka's door. Izuku was the first to speak. "What's going on?" he asked with a furrowed brow. Kirishima was about to speak when Todoroki stopped him and nodded to the girls sleeping. "Right, we want to talk." Kirishima jerked his head for them to follow. They did so, and the rest of the class joined them in an empty hospital room. "What's this about?" Mina asked, and many of their class were also curious. "I think we can help Bakugo." Yaoyorozu put a tracker on the Nomu that was at the camp with someone from 1B's help. "If we ask Yaoyorozu to make us another device to find the tracker as she gave to the heroes, then we can save him from whatever they are doing to him," he said with passion. Izuku scowled at the mere mention of Bakugo and more so when they were having a meeting to go rescue him. Most of the class was shocked at the idea of going out and essentially committing vigilantism. His gang of friends frowned as well at Kirishima's idea. Izuku turned to leave. "Midoriya, where are you going?" Kirishima called out to stop him. "I'm leaving. But you've known Bakugo the longest, don't you want to help him?" he pleaded. Izuku whipped around with fury in his eyes. Kirishima took a step back, seeing the look on his face. "Why would I want to help him? Let me ask you all a question. How many of you figured out why I loathe Bakugo?" He turned to everyone else and most shook their heads or looked confused. Tsuyu spoke up. "I have an idea, and I hope I'm wrong. If it's true, then I will have to question UA's reasoning." "You're right, Kirishima. I've known him for 10 years. Let me tell you a story. Once, there were two boys, they were best of friends, brothers almost. Until one got a powerful quirk, and the other was deemed quirkless. The boy with the powerful quirk was praised that he could no wrong while the other boy was shoved down and beaten for being weak. The powerful quirk user began to have fun with his quirk and used it everywhere and especially on his old friend. For 10 years that continued as the quirkless boy was ignored and beaten by everyone while the powerful boy could do whatever he wanted. He had a powerful quirk after all. Until one day, the quirkless boy got a quirk, and boy did he contemplate some horrible things to use it for. Instead, he trained it as best he could to try to catch up with the rest and instead turned in all the evidence the boy collected to the police. The school was shut down, and the powerful boy was arrested. The once quirkless boy managed to win, but he was covered in scars and distrustful. He was hoping to live the rest of his life without ever seeing the other boy again. The boy was happy not to have to see the other who burned him daily. Until the first day of school. Do you want to guess who the two boys are? Izuku glared at the redhead, who looked sick to the core. The rest of the class wasn't doing much better. "I was wrong. It was worse," Sue croaked sadly. "So, no, I don't want to go rescue Bakugo. He can go rot." Izuku sneered at the idea. "You are lying. Bakugo is brash and rude at times, but he isn't like that. Ua wouldn't allow him to join the hero course." Iida stepped forward and challenged Izuku. "Like you should be talking, you're still here." Izuku shot back. "What's that supposed to mean?" Uraraka asked shakily. "Don't you dare." Iida stepped forward aggressively. "Anyone with enough power can get away with anything, isn't that right?" He looked over at Todoroki, and he looked away. Ida's fist landed on Izuku's face but didn't do any damage. Izuku's eyes turned to Ida's furious ones. There were shouts of alarm from the others at the sudden attack from one of their own. Ida was pushed back, and Izuku lowered his hand from where it was on Ida's chest. He had released enough kinetic energy to shove the bespectacled boy to the ground. Mina, Denki, and Honta stepped close to Izuku, ready to back him up. I want nothing to do with Bakugo. Do what you want. Izuku turned and walked out of the room with Ida's glare on the back of his head. The other three followed their gang leader out of the room. Just about everyone left in the room was conflicted about what was revealed. Todoroki wanted to go after Bakugo. He was kidnapped right under his eyes and felt guilty. But after hearing the truth of who Bakugo was and how similar he was to Endeavor, he was conflicted. Kirishima was close friends with Bakugo and learned what he did shifted his views. Tokiyami and Tsuyu were the first to walk out of the room. Wait, what about the plan? Kirishima called out to them. Tsuyu stopped and looked back at everyone. Midoriya was right, I want nothing to do with this. And I hope you don't do anything foolish. Tokiyami nodded, and they both left. Soon, the class began to disperse after being given the revelation of both why Izuku was the way he was, Bakugo's history, and their connection to each other. The plan Kirishima was building fell apart before it could see the field. Izuku watched the news on the TV in Toru's and Kyoka's room. Currently, All Might was battling against some villain in the Kamino ward. The same ward where Bakugo was and the League was trying to capture him again. The raid to rescue Bakugo began while Ua gave a formal apology to everyone and made a statement. Bakugo was trying to escape from being encircled by the League. It was evident on the news helicopter. The villains Izuku encountered were still seriously hurt. The girl was stumbling and sluggish while the top hat villain was down one arm and if his quirk was based around his hands, half effectiveness. The villain All Might was fighting was strong, he was holding his own against the number one hero. From what Izuku could tell, the villain had used different quirks. He could see when the villain's arm grew and then metal bolts grew out afterwards. Those two could have been connected but when he forced Kurogiri to activate his quirk while unconscious, Izuku was sure that was the man who gave the quirks to the Nomu. Izuku frantically wrote down his theories about having multiple quirks. What could that mean for quirks? Were they part of a person or some attachment has grown on? Did the villain have a limit on the number of quirks he could hold? How many could he use at the same time? The mere idea of that kind of quirk fascinated Izuku to no end and he was happy to have something to research. He turned back to the TV where Bakugo apparently blasted off the ground into Mount Lady's hand and then she threw him like a rat. He barked out a laugh at the scene of Bakugo cartwheeling in the air. All Might had seen his student evacuate the area and began to unleash his full power against the villain. The camera couldn't pick up what the villain was saying but it affected the number one hero. Some world-changing revelation shook All Might and his true form was shown to all of the world. But to his credit, All Might didn't give up and finished off the villain with an earth-shattering punch. There All Might stood emaciated and unsteady on his feet. He was about to say something but Izuku turned off the TV. He didn't care for the man. Izuku returned to playing with the idea of multiple quirks in a body. It was clear to Izuku that he wasn't working alone to create the Nomu. They had a humanoid appearance and were altered either by a quirk or science. Could adding too many quirks in a normal human transform them into Nomu or was there a different process? So many questions and no way to answer them at the moment. Izuku responded to some messages in the group chat from his friends about the news. He went back to his notebook and kept going on theories and fun scenarios with multiple quirks. Another day passed with Izuku spending most of his time at the hospital with Toru and Kyoka. The other members of his gang joined him every once in a while but they didn't stay longer than he did. On the fourth day after the camp, Izuku was detailing a picture for Toru when he heard a noise come from her. Izuku dropped what he was doing and went to her side. Toru, Izuku asked, next to her bed. She groaned and she smiled softly at hearing Izuku's voice. Zuku, she hummed. Toru, Izuku asked gently and took her hand in his. His voice wavered but he stayed near her. Doing in my room, she mumbled. Izuku laughed and remembered to call the doctor. He pushed the button and went back to Toru's side. Not in your room, Toru. No, I'm right. Toru raised her hand and placed it over Izuku's face. Izuku took Toru's hand and held it close to his face. A nurse ran inside with a doctor on her heels. When did she wake? The nurse asked and began to check her pulse and other simple tests while putting on goggles to see Toru. Not 2 minutes ago, Izuku responded but stayed near her. And Mr. O? The doctor asked without looking up. Izuku looked over at her. Nothing yet, he sighed. Don't worry, lad. Miss Hagakure's awakening is a good sign for the others as well. The doctor said as Toru began to regain her senses. The medical professionals backed away to take note of their results and Izuku got close. Izuku, we're at the hospital. What happened? She asked groggily. The League of Villains attacked the camp and you were knocked unconscious by a mist. Do you remember that? Izuku spoke slowly. She began to wake more and more as the seconds ticked by. Yay, I remember seeing a mist and running away but we got drowsy and that's it. Kyoka. In the bed 5 feet away. Everyone is all right, small injuries here and there. Izuku explained. No one was hurt. She pushed herself to sit up and Izuku helped her. Bakugo was kidnapped and then rescued. Izuku shrugged. She blew a raspberry. Fuck Bakugo. Izuku glanced over to see the doctor and nurse stop at that and look over. Izuku bit his lip from laughing. The doctors are still in the room. Oh, heat bloomed on her face and Izuku laughed and pulled her into a hug. This is nice. I'm so happy you're okay. Izuku sniffed. Toru held Izuku back. How long has it been? 4 days. They were long days. Izuku pulled back and smiled. The doctor approached and Izuku stepped away to let them work. Toru answered questions that were asked and to see if she had any mental issues with the mist. Izuku sent a message to the group chat that Toru was awake and it exploded into chatter and frantic back and forward. Toru's parents were notified as well. Before any of Izuku's friends or Toru's parents could show up, Kyoka stirred awake similarly to Toru. Izuku did the whole process again and the same two came in from earlier and went to Kyoka. She was confused and groggy but began to gain awareness just as Toru did. When the doctors left after confirming Kyoka was well, Izuku sat between the two to fill them in on what they missed in the 4 days. Izuku sensed 3 familiar sources of energy getting close fast. Finished telling them the recap of the week when the gang of friends burst through the door and surprised the other two. Izuku watched Mina envelop Toru in a hug and then Kyoka quickly after. The other two were also ecstatic to see them healthy. Makoto and Nagai slammed the door open, startling everyone including Izuku who had to lower his hand again. The two shouted in joy and rushed to Toru's bedside. The others got out of their way and moved to Kyoka's side of the room to give them some privacy. After a bit of time, Toru called them to open the curtain separating the room. Mina peeked her head and pulled the curtain back. Hey, nice to meet you, you must be her parents. Mina introduced herself with a beaming smile. The others followed suit by introducing themselves. Last was Izuku who waved with a small smile. Toru waved him closer and he began to get nervous. Izuku stepped next to Toru's bed and introduced Izuku. And this is Izuku, my boyfriend, she said with a smile. Izuku gave a small smile and nodded. Nagai gave him a reassuring smile but Makoto watched him with a close eye and scanned him up and down. He doesn't seem too impressive. The man said. Dad, Makoto. Both the women admonished him. They were drawn to Mina who barked out a laugh and covered her mouth quickly. Sorry, but Izuku is terrifying. She pointed at him and moved closer. He is a bit short but he is built different. Not swole but beefy. I'm not some prize bull you are selling. Izuku scoffed and pulled his arm away from Mina showing him off. Toru was giggling on the bed as her parents watched the display. He's terrifying. Makoto asked. Your quirk then? And brains, he helped us all with our quirks and improving how we use them. Mina nodded. Izuku was the one who showed me to use my quirk as a focused mirror instead of just invisibility, Toru added. You can protect my daughter then? Makoto asked. I will do everything in my power to do so. But she isn't some damsel in distress, we're all training to be heroes including her. Izuku said with all seriousness. He's right, I don't need him watching over my shoulder. I can take care of myself. Toru said and took Izuku's hand. Makoto was about to open his mouth again but Nagai stopped him. I'm happy to meet Toru's friends finally. She gave them all a warm smile and Izuku a nod. They chatted for a bit longer, then one by one the others had to head home when their parents called them home. Izuku was left with the Hagakures but also thought of leaving them to have more proper privacy. Before leaving, Izuku grabbed his sketchbook and presented it to Toru. She looked surprised and gently took it. "What's this?" Toru asked, and her parents watched in silence. "A gift, something I've been working on for a bit. I'll add to it when there is to add." Izuku smiled and motioned her to look inside. Toru gasped and her parents peeked to see what surprised her. They stood up and moved to see properly when they caught a glimpse of what it was. A front portrait of Toru with incredible detail. It was just black and white, but the detail of each curling hair and each eye was perfect. Izuku felt pride at having his work admired. "Green," Kyoka whispered and waved him over. "What is it?" "I like to draw, so I drew Toru." He smiled. "That's pretty sweet," she said with a soft smile. "Izuku, this is amazing. Better than the one you gave me." Toru pulled Izuku to her. "The first one was a bit rushed since I wanted you to have it. These, I took my time." Izuku motioned to the sketchbook. "It's amazing. Thank you." Toru pulled Izuku into a hug and he reciprocated. He enjoyed the warmth that she filled him with. They pulled away and Izuku motioned to the sketchbook. "That was just the first one." Toru understood immediately and grabbed it and flipped to the next page. It was a copy of their picture taken together in the clearing. Toru was next to Izuku with the others around the two. Instead of her floating clothes queuing in who was there, Toru's head was drawn in with any exposed skin as well. "This is incredible," Nagai admired. She looked up at Izuku. "Thank you for this." She smiled. Makoto gave him a grudging nod. Izuku felt more pride fill him. He gave Toru a farewell hug and she gave him a quick peck on the cheek. He left the hospital just as a woman with hair similar to Kyoka and the same earlobes rushed into the hospital with a shaggy-looking man close behind her. Izuku smiled at seeing them hurry along. He arrived at the apartment and cooked up something to eat and sat to read. He felt more relaxed than he did in a while. That relaxation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Izuku sensed the two heat sources and moved behind the door. The peephole showed Aizawa and All Might standing outside. Izuku scowled slightly and opened the door. "Why are you here?" Izuku asked without waiting. "Your parents should have gotten a call and email from Ua about what was going on," Aizawa said, looking behind Izuku to the interior of the apartment. "And you?" Izuku turned to All Might in his emaciated form. "I have some things to say, but first may we come inside to speak?" Izuku sighed and opened the door for them and got out of the way. He waved them to the living room and went to the kitchen to brew up some coffee and tea. Even if he doesn't like All Might and is distrustful of Aizawa, he will be a good host. The pot of water was boiling in a moment with an application of thermal energy and he brought the tray over to the coffee table. He motioned them to have whatever and sat down. Aizawa took a cup of coffee and All Might just a cup of water. Izuku waited for them to start speaking. Aizawa glanced around the living room and its state. It was clean, but he noticed there were no pictures. It was lived in, but he wouldn't be able to tell by who. All Might for his part sat awkwardly as Izuku stared at the two. "When will your mother be home?" Aizawa asked, setting the cup of coffee down. "Why? What did Ua send out?" Izuku leaned back. "It's better to discuss this with her present," All Might added. Izuku stared at the two and let out a sigh. He got up and went to the junk drawer. The other two watched him curiously and then Izuku came back and tossed the post-it note on the coffee table. He waved for them to look. Aizawa picked it up and read what was on it. "What is this?" he asked with a sinking feeling. Izuku shrugged. "She's gone. Left for greener pastures, I don't know." What do you mean she left?" All Might looked alarmed. "Oh sorry, let me explain. So when I walked into the apartment, that note was on the counter and all her stuff was gone," he said sarcastically. "When was this? When was the last time you saw and spoke to her?" Aizawa furrowed his brow. "I found the note the day after the internships were over. Last time I saw her was over a year ago. Last time I spoke to her, I don't know. That was months ago. Why didn't you say anything?" Aizawa asked seriously. "What for? She paid for the apartment for the next 3 years and I get funds put into my account every week for necessities. What's different between now and before Ua? Nothing. Izuku scowled at Aizawa. She neglected you, that isn't right. All Might said softly. Izuku whipped his head to him. A lot of things aren't fucking right. But I'm luckier than most. Tell me, do you know what the average quirkless person's lifespan is? It's 20. You either die from getting beaten to death, starved with no way to make money, or kill yourself. That's not to mention the ones who go missing. From being sold off to just plain old kidnapping. I was fortunate enough to have a roof over my head and food in my stomach. Why would I ask for more from Inko? He said with cold fury at his circumstances. I am fortunate enough that she left me with everything I needed to take care of myself. He sat back after his rant. They were quiet for a moment as Izuku collected himself. Why are you here? He asked calmly. UA is putting in a dorm system and it's required for 1A and 1B to live there for their safety, Aizawa explained steadily. His mind spun around what his student had said. Safety. Izuku scoffed and sighed. Right then, I'll start packing. He had no reason to leave UA, his friends are there and it furthers his goals. There's still much we need to discuss, more so with your situation. All Might said. Go on then. Muscular. What did you do to him? Aizawa asked. I absorbed his electric energy from his nervous system to stop him from killing Kota. Izuku waited to see the results of his theory. He is brain dead, Aizawa said and watched Izuku carefully. Izuku nodded. It was a possibility. Either doing so would have caused his body to go limp and shut down for a moment and then recover or cause brain death. He hummed. This is a serious matter, Aizawa said harshly. Of course it is. But I'm not getting arrested, otherwise you would have done so already or been kicked out of UA because you were talking about the dorms. Izuku said logically. You essentially killed a man. All Might furrowed his brows. So have you. That wound you have on your side was made by the man with multiple quirks and you said you ended him. How do you know of him? All Might began to stand. I stopped a monster who was going to kill a child. He was no different from a Nomu except he could think and talk. Izuku ignored All Might's aggressive response. As for how I know of that villain. The fucking news, I saw it with my own eyes. He made a face as if he was asking, are you serious? Back to the topic at hand. Aizawa stopped them from keep arguing. That isn't something you should decide until you are a professional. Izuku nodded sagely. Of course, if only there was a safe place to train and learn without having to fight for our lives. He mocked. Aizawa pursed his lips at the jab. Is there something else we need to speak about or are we done? All Might sighed and stood up with the intent to bow. I am sorry. For the grief I've caused you in the past or present. If there is anything to repay you, please just ask. Izuku stared at the number 1 hero bowing to him. Anything. Expel Bakugo Katsuki and have his red tapped file opened. He said casually. All Might straightened and made a face. I cannot do that. Then get out. Send the information about the dorms to me and I'll be ready to go. He said, already knowing what his answer would be. Aizawa handed Izuku a packet of papers about the dorm system and got up. He wanted to say something to the boy but the look Izuku gave him stopped him. All Might walked out with a grimace but said nothing. Izuku walked them to the door and closed it softly behind them. With a sigh, he cleaned up after the two and began to pack what he would need for the dorms. He read through the packet of information and it was pretty straightforward. What the school would provide and what the rooms would have. Izuku rubbed his face at the complications that will rise from letting UA know more about him. To be continued. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and now we will see you in the next video.